evil, and deadly attacks by Al-Qaeda and other terrorists.
And now live coverage of a discussion on Homeland Security financing. Among the speakers today, Admiral James Loy, Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. This is just getting underway. At the podium right now is William Laurie, President of Equity International. That's the group that's organized this event.
The billions in new spending will pay for the best Homeland Security products and services. How much that spending is and will be, where it will go, and how the private sector can participate is the subject of today's briefing. We have an outstanding program for you this morning comprised of leading experts on Homeland Security financing and programs. And we are honored to have as our keynote speaker Mark Holman, Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. On Friday afternoon, Admiral James Loy, the new TSA chief, had to withdraw from today's program because of a last-minute scheduling conflict, but we look forward to including him in a future briefing. The Pentagon is also working with us to provide you with an outstanding array of speakers on Homeland Security programs of the military, and they will be featured in our August 26th briefing. Our first session this morning is a powerful panel on Homeland Security spending by the U.S. federal government. We are fortunate to have as our moderator Donald Vincent, a Vice President at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he leads the firm's Homeland Security campaign. Within the defense team, Mr. Vincent leads business efforts in counterterrorism, consequence management, nuclear, biological, chemical defense, and survivability. He has over 25 years of experience in management, testing, research, and development programs for survivability regarding weapons of mass destruction. Mr. Vincent is also the officer in charge of the operation of Booz Allen's Information Analysis Centers for the Defense Technical Information Center. Over the past 10 years, Mr. Vincent led the formulation of Booz Allen's counterterrorism business involving weapons of mass destruction. This team is involved in counterterrorism efforts throughout the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the intelligence community, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and several federal, state, and local government response agencies. Projects managed include such activities as the Lund-Lugar-Domenici Domestic Preparedness Program, the DoD Installation Preparedness Program, and the Biological Warfare Improved Response Program. In 1998, Mr. Vincent joined several other Booz Allen officers in establishing the Infrastructure Assurance Center of Excellence at Fairview Park, Virginia. The purpose of this center is establishing synergy between the law enforcement, information assurance, national security, and critical infrastructure capabilities of the firm in support of clients in the federal government and commercial markets who are responding to several presidential decision directives and programs in Homeland Security. The capability teams within the IA Center of Excellence are a critical component of the firm's global strategy security initiatives, focusing on public and private issues surrounding continuity of business and continuity of operations in the wake of the September 11th attacks. Welcome.
Thanks, Bill, for that kind introduction. I would also like to thank Equity International, as I'm sure all of the people in the audience do, for hosting this important series of conferences. Things have changed a lot, as we all know, and it is vital for all of us in industry in supporting the initiatives of the Homeland Security strategy of the nation to understand how budget decisions are being made, what is happening as changes do occur. The purpose of this panel, as Bill said, is to focus on the Homeland Security related spending priorities. This is very timely, especially with the passage last week of the FY02 supplemental, as well as the ongoing debate about standing up this new important Department of Homeland Security. I'm sure our two distinguished panelists will have a lot more to say on that subject in great detail. One observation I would like to make, though, we all know that since 9/11, the way we approach budgeting and decisions has shifted. This is a very difficult set of problems. As Bill mentioned earlier, this is going to be solved not at the federal level, not at the local level. It's going to be a federal, state, and local solution. All of us are going to have to participate. And that creates quite a bit of difficulty, especially at the state and local level. most of the procurement officials, where a lot of the spending is that we're talking about and the budget issues that we're debating are going to take place. That is where the rubber is going to meet the road at the state and local level. A lot of these programs are going to need to be executed by combined capabilities of federal, state, and local organizations who normally don't talk to each other, normally don't understand how to procure certain of the kinds of services we need. In recent conversations the past 3 or 4 months that I've had with corporate executives, one of the things on their minds has been this issue of indemnification and liabilities. And I'm very pleased to see in some of the recent language, language has adopted some provisions to look into that issue, because what you may end up having, as we don't want to have, is a lowest cost technically acceptable offerer preparing the national security strategy for the country. I think we all want to make sure we get the best products out there and the best solutions going forward. With that said, I would like to introduce William Hoagland, Staff Director to the Senate Committee on the Budget. Bill has served in this position since 1982. He reports directly to the committee's ranking member, Pete Domenici. Bill assists the committee in meeting the obligation to provide oversight of all fiscal policy legislation that comes before the Senate. Bill is also a published author, most recently writing a piece on the World Trade Organization development prospects in the March issue of Policy Forum. I believe that last month, during this same panel, Bill predicted that the Homeland Security spending in the FY02 supplemental would end up being about $5 to $8 billion. Well, from what I understand, he was about right. It came in around $6.7 billion. At least that's what seems to be in the press reports. With that, I'm sure there's a career after Bill decides to change his focus on prognosticating the weather, maybe in this region. He could do very well. With that, I'd be interested in what new insights you have for us, Bill. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. The last thing I'm going to do is get into predicting the weather. Thank you all for the invitation to speak again to your briefing on Homeland Security financing. As the President stated in releasing his national strategy for Homeland Security about 2 weeks ago, and I quote, "The U.S. government has no more important mission than protecting the homeland." He went on further to say that this is a huge, new, and a very complex challenge. Now, separate and apart from the very serious policy issues of providing for Homeland Security, for the level of federal expenditures involved, which I'll get into in a minute here, the financing and budgeting for Homeland Security nationwide is one of the more difficult budget issues that I've had to sort out in my nearly 20-year career with the Senate Budget Committee. Budgeting for Homeland Security requires an acceptable agreement about the definition of what Homeland Security is. When I appeared before this forum about a month ago, I expressed some frustration, I believe, with not having a working definition of Homeland Security for the purposes of accounting and for us budgeteers. I said that the definition of Homeland Security had evolved in the aftermath of 9/11, and that this was likely to continue to evolve, the definition, as more became known about the real and perceived and potential threats. I cannot completely repeat that criticism entirely today, because when the national strategy was released a couple of weeks ago, it did have a definition. Let me read it to you. Homeland Security is a concerted national effort to prevent terrorist attacks within the United States, reduce America's vulnerability to terrorism, and minimize the damage and recover from attacks that do occur. I took out of that definition three key concepts: prevention, protection, and minimization or consequence management. But how those three objectives, prevention, protection, and minimization, get translated to specific funding for different programs and accounts, I believe will continue to be an evolving process. I have to look no further than around where I work to see how the different programs and projects and accounts are being debated daily to fit within the definition of Homeland Security. I doubt seriously that we will ever come to a satisfactory definition, and therefore for financing purposes and for making decisions on allocating public resources and private resources, financing and budgeting will remain an evolving issue. And this is more than just a green eye shade issue. It is more than just an academic exercise. Public and private resources are limited. Costs need to be weighed with the risks. I wish otherwise, but unfortunately I think we all know we are now living in a world where terrorist attacks will never be completely eliminated, and that is why public resources are being allocated to programs that are designed to minimize the damage and recover from attacks once they do occur. As cold as it sounds, weighing the cost against the risk, number of lives lost versus resources devoted to it, is the nature of public budgeting in this arena. If we are not allocating our resources to those programs that will save the greatest number at the least cost and disruption to daily lives, then the public's confidence in the government, its most basic responsibility under the Constitution to provide for domestic tranquility, is undermined. Even though the President's national strategy says, quote, "We will spend whatever is necessary to secure the homeland," we now face, for the foreseeable future, the return of federal deficits. States face their worst fiscal crisis in a decade, and we would debate, in fact, this week in the Senate, a major increase in federal entitlement benefits for health care in the prescription drug area with an aging population. There are limits to the public purse. So what is defined as Homeland Security and how we fund Homeland Security and what we give up to fund Homeland Security within this fiscal setting is very critical. So having said all this, and setting the stage, let me try to sort out the numbers a little. I see my role here this morning to provide a macro picture on financing and later speakers to become more micro in identifying programs and projects. In my career, many times I see numbers somehow take on a life of their own. And I believe in the minds of the American public, and not too many, and not a few senators and congressmen, the federal government spent $40 billion on emergency supplemental immediately following the attacks last fall, and that somehow, that number framed the level of federal government spending and has become the level of Homeland Security. Not so. Of the $40 billion that was immediately approved after the attacks, about 13 of it was for Homeland Security, 5 for the previous fiscal year and 8 for the current fiscal year. And the bulk of that $40 billion went direct to direct and indirect military assistance and cleanup operations in New York, Pentagon, Pennsylvania. So what are we spending in the current fiscal year, 2002, as compared to last year, and where might the figure be going next year and beyond? Roughly speaking, including the supplemental bill that Don spoke about, assuming that that is signed either today, tomorrow, or sometime this week, which will add another $6.5 billion to Homeland Security, the federal government will provide about $38 billion to programs defined under that definition of Homeland Security this year. And for purposes of comparison, let's make clear that that's more than a doubling from less than $20 billion that was being spent prior to 9/11. Let me be clear. $38 to $40 billion is a significant sum of money. But remember, the federal government expends $2 trillion annually. So this sum is less than 2% of all federal spending, an amount just about equal to the combination of the federal food stamp program and school lunch program put together, $38 billion. In fairness to my colleague Scott Lilly here from the House Appropriations Committee, this $38 to $40 billion does not compete against all that $2 trillion in spending, but rather that primarily in his committee's jurisdiction, and that which is limited to what we call non-defense domestic spending. And compared this way, Homeland Security, that $38-40 billion, represents about 8 to 9% of total spending in that classified against those types of programs. But you're up against some pretty major and tough competitors: education, EPA, national parks, highways, NIH, state and local economy, veterans benefits, NASA, and many more. I have tried to take this spending then and see where it fits into the definition of prevention, protection, and minimization. And for the real budgeteers and the green eye shades, a few of them that I see here, I've taken a publication that didn't receive much attention prior to 9/11, but it's been put out since 1998, OMB's annual report on combating terrorism. And in there, there's a classification, another classification, which then I've collapsed and used to try to define where these dollars are. So let me go through it real quickly. For today, post 9/11, again, assuming the President signs the supplemental, which I'm sure he will, I conclude that roughly 42% of all Homeland Security spending this year falls into the prevention area. And that represents nearly a 60% increase in resources devoted to this area before 9/11. And in prevention, I'm using spending for investigations, intelligence, offensive activities. This clearly involves the Department of Justice, law enforcement functions, FBI, Department of Energy, National Nuclear Security Administration, State Department's visa programs. And the total approximately $18 billion out of that 38. For today, in prevention, post 9/11, assuming a supplemental, I conclude that about 40%, around about $17 billion, is being devoted to prevention. And that represents about a 50% increase in resources devoted to this area prior to 9/11. Here again, in the protection area, we define spending to be those programs that provide physical security to government facilities, critical infrastructures, government employees, and physical protection of the national populace. Here we are looking at the Transportation Security Administration, border agencies, Coast Guard, telecommunications protection, U.S. Corps of Engineers, and other agencies. Finally, on minimization, about $10 billion, I conclude that 20%, around about 20%, of all our spending at the federal level is devoted to damage and recovery from attacks once they do occur. And here also I've thrown in research and development expenditures. In this area of the federal government's efforts has more than quadrupled after 9/11, from less than $2 billion to well over $10 billion this year. Not surprising, we are talking about efforts of FEMA, Health and Human Services, CDC, President's proposed Corporation for National Community, spending programs of first responders to train, detect, and better equip themselves proactively. So summarizing then, federal spending this year, well over $40 billion or close to $40 billion, double that prior to 9/11. Prevention represents 42% of that, a 60% increase. Protection represents about 40%, a 50% increase. Minimization, consequence, and management, about 20%, but a quadrupling of spending relative to 9/11. And finally, where are we going with financing next year? Plus a final word on the Department of Homeland Security, if I might. For next year, using the President's budget request as a guide, total Homeland Security will remain, interestingly enough, relatively unchanged, close to about $40 billion if you accept the President's request that's now pending before Congress. Congress has not completed any of its appropriation bills for fiscal year 2003, so I would not be surprised if with supplementals next year that we're not topping $45 billion in spending at the federal level when we complete and the books are racked up. But important here, if the President's budget request holds, and we will do at least as much as the President's request, prevention spending will stabilize at about where we are this year. And protection, that component of the budget, protection I guess on the assumption that the sites will have been hardened and completed, in this area we'll see a decline in federal resources devoted next year. But minimization and consequence management will continue to increase nearly 30% as we go through the budget for next year. Now, I'm not making a judgment on whether this allocation of resources is appropriate or not. Others, much more qualified and expert in this area, will have to address that. But it is clear that the national strategy does suggest a redirection of resources toward prevention and minimization moving into 2004. In the national strategy, something that's odd, that's surprised me, was a telegraphing of the fiscal year 2004 budget that we're moving into already. And let me run off the quick highlights of the priorities that budget will have and make my editorial comment. There's just about 8 of them here. These will be the priorities in the budget that's coming up for fiscal year 2004. The first one is enhance the analytical capabilities of the FBI. Prevention. Build new capabilities through the Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection Division of the proposed Department of Homeland Security. Prevention. Create smart borders. Prevention. Increase the security of the international shipping containers. Prevention. Recapitalize the Coast Guard. Prevention. Prevent terrorist use of nuclear weapons through better sensors and procedures. I'll put that into the protection category. And develop broad-spectrum vaccines, antimicrobials, and antidotes. Prevention. Then there's one, integrate information sharing across the federal government, somewhat cross-cutting. It's clear that the direction is moving in the direction of prevention, away from the protection aspects of that definition that I laid out. Finally, on the Department of Homeland Security. The House, of course, passed their version of this legislation last Friday. I would say, only as a staff person from the United States Senate, that the Senate is scheduled to begin the consideration of the legislation. And those who understand Senate procedures, what I would expect is that we will have a cloture vote on the motion to proceed to consider it, but we will not get to the Homeland Security legislation until after the upcoming August recess. We have a great deal on our platter for this week if we are to get out of town by the end of the week. I've made available to you a chart that we put together, which we've tried to visualize how this new department's going to look. I won't go into that unless you have some questions. But as a budgeteer, and I have to throw this out at you again, another number, please note, oddly, these numbers keep coming back. The Department of Homeland Security is advertised as a $37 billion, sound familiar? Figure. But strangely enough, when you go through it, what you will find is that only 2/3 of the Department of Homeland Security expenditures is for those things that have been defined as Homeland Security in my definition. I'm sorry the numbers all sound familiar, but I repeat that not all of the spending, in fact, only 2/3 of the spending in the new Department of Homeland Security is devoted to Homeland Security. The rest is devoted, the other 1/3 is devoted to things non-Homeland Security, which makes you understand why coordination at the higher level in terms of the executive office and the president's office is required here. Let me close by stating probably the obvious. Financing Homeland Security is not the sole responsibility of the federal government, as Bill had indicated at the outset. A national strategy is indeed that, national. It must be founded on the precepts of our federalism form of government and free market economy. In fact, some estimates you will hear later this morning suggest that the federal government's resources make up only about 40% of all spending, the bulk of the remainder being right where you work in the private sector. So if we spend $100 billion annually, federal, state, local, private. Those costs will impact businesses and governments in the future. But let me remind everyone one more time, $100 billion is 1% of our national product, gross national product of $10 trillion, an extremely small cost for securing our homeland. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Now I would like to introduce Scott Lilly, who has served as the Minority Staff Director of the House Appropriations Committee since January 1995. Scott is responsible for the minority staff of the committee and for recommending overall legislative strategies with respect to discretionary spending to committee Democrats and the House Democratic leadership. Like Bill, Scott was also present at last month's session, and as I understand it, Scott's prediction was that the current administration projections for FY03 of about $37 billion, that magic number again, for the new Department of Homeland Security are far below requirements, to the tune that Congress will probably push for an additional $8 to $9 billion supplemental after the November elections. Although we don't know yet whether that prediction will become a reality, I suspect Scott has a very good understanding of what the type of spending will be really required. And with that, I'll turn the panel over to Scott.
Thank you. Once again, I'm in a position of finding very little that I can disagree with Bill on. It's surprising that two people who come not only from different political parties, but even more importantly from different sides of Capitol Hill, and probably even more surprisingly from different committees. He's a Budget Committee guy and I'm an Appropriations Committee guy. Tend to agree on so many different things, but I think he did a very good job of summing up the overall numbers. I'd like to get into a little bit of the philosophy and division of resources within those numbers and talk about what I think our big problems were. I was asked to talk and say many of the things I said a month ago, and I'll try to do that, but since the House has already acted on the Homeland Security bill, the Senate is expected to, as Bill pointed out, sometime in the near future. I think we're in a different place than we were a few weeks ago. And the decisions about making up that Department of Homeland Security, whether they're good decisions or bad decisions, those will soon have been made, and there are so many other choices that we have to face that I think we need to move on and look at what lies ahead of us. When we talk about having a secure homeland, I think it is important to recognize that being secure has been a unique part of the American experience. It is one thing that has separated us and given us an advantage over other nations and other societies. In less than 300 years, the United States has grown from a tiny society in a remote corner of the world to the dominant power in global affairs. That ascendancy is in no small part related to the fact that we had two great oceans to protect us during times of trouble in Europe or Asia or Africa. That security, the security of those oceans gave the early settlers an opportunity to establish a social order that was not affected by outside disturbances. And it gave us the opportunity to have a society where decisions were based on law rather than force. It provided the foundation for creating democratic institutions. And it allowed us to allocate our energies toward generating wealth and building better lives for ourselves and our families. And it allowed us to engage in commercial activities that were not disrupted by foreign armies. It allowed a more precise opportunity to calculate the potential for profit or loss, which allowed us to evolve very complex and efficient financial institutions. And it allowed us to invest more in education and research and physical infrastructure, all of which are explanations for why the United States has evolved into the kind of power and wealth that we now see. But on September 11th, the barriers that those oceans provided against foreign trouble seemed to all but disappear, and we became painfully aware how much we had taken those for granted. We entered a new era with not only an enormous loss of life and property, but with a profound loss of the feeling of security. We now face a huge struggle to regain some portion of that security. And anyone who is tempted to seriously understand what will be involved understands what an extraordinarily large and complex problem we face. We have a huge array of government activities that we have to improve their performance. And we also have a great many areas where we need to create activities that none now exist. We face an opponent that appears as relentless and clever as he is warped and disconnected from reality. He is willing to suffer catastrophic losses, and he is capable of constant renewal. He is not an individual, and his name is not bin Laden. Rather, our enemy is an idea, an aspiration, shared by perhaps millions of poor, ignorant, and disaffected youth, hoping to avenge the honor of Saladin and reverse hundreds of years of history. This is not the predominant political view in either the Arab or Muslim world. It is strongly rejected as madness by nearly all current official political leaders, including many who have been arch adversaries of the United States. But it has sympathizers from the mountains of Kashmir to the bazaars in Riyadh, the streets of Cairo, the coastal villages of Morocco, the slums of Brussels, and even the strip malls in Annandale. Many politicians like to refer to our effort in coming to terms with that as war. But in truth, we are far from waging war. I think Bill just pointed that out in the numbers that he brought to your attention. We are, in fact, largely involved in a game of political cover at this point. Political posturing has taken clear precedence over a systematic effort to organize and manage the resources and strategies that we need to win this struggle. Nothing could make this clearer than the efforts we have seen in the past week toward enacting legislation creating a Department of Homeland Security. Politicians in both the executive and legislative branches of government and members of both parties have attempted to represent this legislation as the central policy decision with which we must grapple the combat of terrorism. But literally no one familiar with government efforts to combat terrorists can take this seriously. First of all, the department will contain only a fraction of the government activities and efforts with respect to counterterrorism. If you look at the administration's own chart that they put in the press release they released in June when they announced they wanted to do a Department of Counterterrorism, they had 133 boxes of government agencies and offices engaged in counterterrorism. The new department, as they proposed it, would contain only 22 of those 133. That leaves 111, or 83%, of the boxes on their chart outside the department. Secondly, the department contains virtually none of the activities relating to finding or eliminating terrorists. It contains none of the functions related to encouraging other governments to do so, and I think that's an extremely important part of the overall effort. And it contains only a portion of the functions relating to preventing terrorist acts here in the United States. If you had to choose one agency that is most centrally involved in combating terrorism, I think you'd have to pick either the FBI or the CIA. Neither is in the department. Neither is the State Department, nor the Northern Command or the National Guard or any other part of the military or the Pentagon. Also excluded are the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, and the Department of Energy. The point is that creating a department does not solve our need to coordinate these disparate activities and bureaucracies. Next, the creation of the department will not expand the resources available even for the activities within the department. In fact, based on the administration's own assurances, the opposite is true. The administration insists that the new department will cost no more than the activities of the existing agencies. At the same time, they are proposing 30 sub-cabinet offices, including 5 undersecretaries. That's 5 times as many as the Department of Veteran Affairs has, which is of the same size, both in terms of dollars and people, and 16 assistant secretaries, all of whom will have offices, all of whom will have equipment, all of whom will have large staffs. All of those expenses will have to come out of the ongoing operations of the activities of the department. That means that we will have to cut back, if we maintain this promise, frontline efforts such as inspecting cargo, monitoring airports, and controlling borders. Next, the creation of the department will not improve the management of the activities transferred to it or the efficiency with which we use those security resources, at least in the near term. Any reorganization has its cost. These can be measured not only in dollars, but in lost time of every employee that gets a new boss, a new phone number, a new office, or is moved to a new city. These costs can be recouped within a period of time if the pieces fit together, if the organization is well thought out, and if it's well managed. There is ample concern that none of those may happen with this new department. While the Congress will probably eliminate a number of the most disparate activities proposed in the department, such as pet store regulation, international adoption, boll weevil eradication, or biomedical research, all of these were part of the White House proposal of agencies and offices to go into the department. There is what we will probably send the President in September for him to sign is far from a tidy package. It will still include such activities as oil spill cleanups, marine safety and rescue, earthquake and hurricane recovery, duty collection, and lighthouse operations. In addition to these activities, we still face enormous challenges in creating a massive bureaucracy for screening travelers and their air travelers and their luggage. A challenge that has so far been handled in a manner that leaves little confidence in the ability of the administration to organize large new bureaucracies. I'm sorry that Admiral Loy, who is now recently been put in charge of that, is not going to be able to speak to this group. I understand he is a very talented administrator, and I hope he will be given a free hand by the department, by OMB, and the White House in putting together a sensible plan for making that agency work. It's high time, and we wish him the best. My point here is that we have been engaged in a very intense exercise that has received a lot of attention but has done little to address the most serious problems facing us. There has been a lot of movement, but that has been mistaken for progress. And the movement has, as perhaps was the intention, diverted attention from efforts to deal with the real problems. On September 11th, it was apparent that we needed a government-wide effort to coordinate the wide-ranging activities in numerous departments and agencies that was necessary in winning the war against terror. That is still true today. The creation of the department did not solve that problem. It did nothing and will do nothing to improve the analytical capabilities of the FBI, capabilities that they must have if they're going to put together the millions of bits of information that they take in each day. It did nothing to increase the number of Arabic, Farsi, or Pashto translators at NSA or the CIA or the FBI. It has done nothing and will do nothing to speed up the availability of secure and modern computer systems to help our intelligence and law enforcement agencies. And I think many of you may already know what a terrible situation we have in the FBI with respect to computers and how frustrated we have been in trying to upgrade and modernize that capacity. It will do nothing to deal with the fact that most of our embassies and consulates are not hardened or sufficiently secure. It will do nothing to provide the resources to begin rebuilding the rebuilding process in Afghanistan, a process that is critical to getting the tribal leaders to buy into the new government and to allow us to rout out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda that are still there and are still thriving in the mountains of northern Pakistan and southern Afghanistan. This whole debate has served to obscure the fact that we are not making the kind of progress we need to make in a wide range of critical areas. We have simply been engaged in rearranging the boxes. The most salient critique I have of the effort so far is we've tried to do it on the cheap. Following Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Commerce Department was commissioned by the White House to find a means of measuring national output. The department's effort evolved into a concept known as gross domestic product. The original purpose of that exercise was to determine how much output could be generated to support a war effort. The goal was to channel as much as 50% of GNP into fighting World War II. I point this out not because we need to spend 50% in order to fight the war on terrorism, but to put some perspective on the current effort. While 50% would clearly be too much, as Bill pointed out, 1% certainly would not be an overstatement. Yet we have been fighting day in and day out on a bipartisan basis and with both houses of Congress over trying to channel more needed resources into agencies and activities run by people appointed by this administration with the strong daily opposition of the Director of Office and Management and Budget and the White House staff. I'll give you an example of one of the arguments we're having. The Secretary of Energy, Secretary Abram, strong supporter of President Bush, said in a letter to OMB this spring, "We are storing vast amounts of material that remain highly volatile and subject to unthinkable consequences if placed in the wrong hands. These materials permeate the departmental complex, including sites under the programmatic jurisdiction of the National Security, Nuclear Security Administration, the Office of Environmental Management, and the Office of Science. Although the initial supplemental and funds appropriated by Congress helped to respond, and those funds were provided with the objection of OMB, although those helped to respond to the most urgent near-term security needs, the Department is now unable to meet the next round of critical security mission requirements. Failure to support those urgent security requirements is a risk that would be unwise. The Department asked for a total of $380 million for a variety of activities. OMB provided $27 million. In a letter by one of Secretary Abrams' subordinates, also a Bush appointee, to OMB, they stated, "We are disconcerted that OMB refused our security supplemental request. I would have much preferred to have heard this from you personally and have been given the opportunity to discuss, not to mention appeal your decision." And it doesn't stop with the Department of Energy. You have a similar situation at the FBI, where the recreation or the creation of the Trilogy computer program, which I think is central to our understanding the activities of al-Qaeda in this country, has been thwarted. The Bureau asked for $1.5 billion for a variety of activities, including Trilogy. None was provided in the administration's request last fall. They objected to the additions that the Congress made. And the final portion of those funds is contained in this supplemental and was a subject of disagreement as recently as last week. There is also a situation with respect to these items, which we had to appropriate them as emergencies, which must be designated as emergencies by the President. In order to encourage him to make that designation, we put them all together in one package. The Director of OMB is indicating that he is going to ask the President not to designate those, so none of those funds would be made available. Among the items that would be left unavailable would be funds for the Agriculture Department Food Safety Inspection Service to make sure that none of the food that's being brought into the United States has been tainted. in terms of meats. The same funds were added to the Food and Drug Administration for the types of foods that they have inspection responsibility fund for. Money to improve and upgrade our embassies and consulates overseas would be lost. The money, and I find this absolutely astounding, the Agency for International Development was asked to keep their request down for development in Afghanistan because of the tight budget. As a result, they asked for only $150 million. The Office of Management budget cut that to $30 million. Now, we have restored the full AID request. We have been told by not only the State Department and the military, but also the Central Intelligence agencies, that our chances of removing troops from Afghanistan and going back to some normalized process and getting full cooperation from Pakistani tribal leaders is absolutely essential. There is no area where the President's reputation or standing as a leader is more on the line than what we do in Afghanistan, and the failure to get the money out to begin these irrigation projects and various projects that will allow some opportunity for jobs and future prosperity is absolutely essential to that project, absolutely essential to that goal, and yet it is being opposed. I would say in conclusion that we need to greatly strengthen White House coordination over all of these disparate activities. We need a more detailed plan for what we want to do with Homeland Security than the one that was submitted 2 weeks ago. And most of all, we need someone engaged in Homeland Security who has a real say over resources and is responsible for seeing that security is weighed at least as evenly as budgetary decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. We have about 11 to 12 minutes available in this panel session, and I'd open the questions from the floor for these distinguished panelists. If anyone has any thoughts or questions you'd like to add. Yes?
I have a simple question. Compared to what Scott just said, do you anticipate restructuring of the authorizing and appropriating committees to go along with the new department?
In the Senate, unfortunately, I do not believe there will be any restructuring of the legislative makeup of committees. I implicit within or explicit in your question, I think you're suggesting it should, and I would not disagree. But it's not likely to happen anytime soon.
I think there'll be an attempt. I wouldn't put money on it, but I think there'll be some minor movement of jurisdiction within appropriation subcommittees, and it could be more significant. But we have, we have a number of departments that are funded through various subcommittees. The Department of Health and Human Services is partially funded in the Agriculture Bill as well as Labor Age Bill, so it wouldn't be unprecedented. But I think there are some of these things, particularly the great hope, I think, of this department, and I said most of the negative things, but I do think that there needs to be an effort to bring together all of these border activities. And I think if we could get a group of people thinking about those activities as a collective, we could achieve some efficiencies and do a better job.
The President signs the supplemental this week. When do those dollars actually get to the states and to the locals?
Depends on when OMB apportions them. They are O2 monies, and so they should go out right away. But that's another area where we've had difficulty is holding up the apportionment of funds.
I want to just add something Scott said, if you were listening very carefully. There are monies that were appropriated by Congress in this supplemental that the President, when he signs the bill, he will sign the bill, But there are monies that are subject to the president declaring those monies emergency. Now, this sounds very budget tease, but I think there is some indication that things like Department of Energy, weapons funding, that Congress requested be an emergency, but the president did not request be an emergency. If he does not declare it an emergency within 30 days of the signature, those monies will not go out. Therefore, within the supplemental that he signs, there's nearly $5 billion. And because my friends on the Appropriation Committee added some language which said all or nothing, I'm afraid that $5 billion of that supplemental is in question when the president signs the overall supplemental today or tomorrow or whenever.
Any other questions? Yes.
In the funding that was approved prior for the earlier supplementals, has there been any oversight on as to how that has been spent or if it's been spent by the committees?
We've been tracking that down. There is a substantial amount that has not been spent that is to a very great extent in FEMA, and it is to a very great extent New York recovery. I think we knew when we appropriated that this recovery was going to be a long-term process. I think quite properly FEMA doesn't pay bills until the bills are presented, so every time a truck carried debris across the river and came back, we paid that bill, but we didn't pay anything before it happened. So the subway reconstruction, all of that is involved in funds that will go out more slowly. Most of the other items most of it is military. The military has not only spent that money, but they are having to borrow from other pockets in order to cover operation costs at this point. And there are other kinds of things that we need to be doing. One big area is this FBI computer problem, and it's just simply organizing that procurement and paying for each piece as it arrives is a timely process, and one that you want to happen as quickly as possible, but you want it done right at the same time.
Just real quick, for appropriate question, I believe the administration uses this argument that I'm about to give as one of the reasons why some of the monies in the current supplemental may not be declared an emergency. It is based on our tracking as of the end of May. In that emergency supplemental, the $40 billion package that I talked about immediately post 9/11, if you take out the military that Scott talked about, that's been obligated. Only through the end of May, I believe it was, 40%, only 40% of that supplemental funding had been obligated.
If there's going to be no reorganization of the committees and subcommittees, can you tell us which committees and subcommittees will have oversight of the new department?
The United States Senate, the Committee of Jurisdiction that has been taking the lead on this, of course, is Senator Lieberman's Committee on Governmental Affairs. This is for confirmation purposes of, and by the way, Scott, in the Senate, I think we have more assistant secretaries and undersecretaries than even in the president's proposal. So this thing is going to pyramid a little bit. But governmental affairs in the United States Senate will probably have primary jurisdiction. It is a complicating jurisdictional issue because judiciary, banking, agriculture, environment all feel that they have a piece of this, but the overriding jurisdiction will be governmental affairs, Senator Lieberman's committee.
On appropriations, The largest portion of this department is transportation. The Transportation Infrastructure Authorizing Committee has the single biggest piece of it. On our appropriations subcommittees, transportation would have that portion. VA HUD has the FEMA portion. And the Treasury Post Office Subcommittee has Customs and Secret Service and the other law enforcement capacities.
The National Security Strategy lays out 80 initiatives, both current and future, that the administration intends to pursue. Do you have any sensing as to which of those or how many of those will require new funding and whether or not they'll be supported?
Well, you know what Bill pointed this out in his statement, but what I find extraordinary with a lot of these things, I think most of them are good ideas. I mean, there has been a very strong bipartisan consensus on the Hill to fund all of this stuff. I don't think the president's asked for very much of anything that he hasn't got funding for. The one exception has been the Transportation Security Administration, where the capacity to organize the department is just, or the agency has fallen apart. But so we thought we had to slow down because we didn't think there was any prospect that they'd spend the money well. Not that we didn't want it spent on the things that they asked for. But what I find amazing is that they're asking or suggesting that they're going to improve the analytical capability of the FBI in the 04 bill. I mean, why would anybody wait to do that? Why would you wait until 04 to have that initiative? We have a desperate problem now. We have, if you go over 3 blocks from here and go through there, you'll find boxes and boxes of data, of tapes, of wiretaps that no one has ever read. And if the people have read them, they don't have any capacity to put them together. They don't have any capacity to make sense out of them. So why would we wait until October, a year from this October, to start developing that capacity? And that's something that should have been in the supplemental and would have been had we not been under such severe pressure in terms of overall funding. And it certainly ought to be in the 03 bill.
I just would support what Scott has said, that if anything, all those initiatives that are in the strategy that the President has outlined are going to be supported. The question is, Congress will probably want to do it faster, sooner, and more of it. And one area which you may have followed last week was in the Senate, where we were talking about establishing new safeguards in our nuclear centers, plants. Those activities, I think, will receive more attention in Congress than is in the initiative here. It's not the fact that the President doesn't address it, it's the matter of degree to which we are adding to it, and I would imagine there would be more, not less.
I think we have time to squeeze in one more short question. If not,
Sure.
We'd like to thank very much our distinguished panelists, Bill Hoagland and Scott Wills.
A few additional seats up in the front for those people in the back. I'd also like to thank Bill Hoagland and Scott Lilly for their excellent presentations, and to Don Vincent for his excellent job as moderator. We are now excited to bring you a powerful and detailed presentation on total projected Homeland Security spending in 2003. To provide that presentation is Linda H. Taskett, a principal and the leader of Homeland Security and Defense for Deloitte Consulting. Deloitte Consulting is one of the leading management consultancies serving large public and private sector clients such as the U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, General Motors, and Bayer. Ms. Taskett has been with Deloitte Consulting for 8 years, where she has focused on large-scale technology-enabled transformation for some of Deloitte's leading clients, including Pacific Bell, ConAgra, and Northrop Grumman. Ms. Taskett has more than 24 years of experience in technology integration, where she has helped to solve complex business issues from financial performance improvement to supply chain integration in a variety of industries, including public sector, telecommunications, consumer products, and high-tech manufacturing. Welcome again, Linda.
Appreciate it. Is this thing ready to go? Super. Well, good morning. As Bill shared with you, my name is Linda Taskett, and I am a principal with Deloitte Consulting. For those of you that are not aware, Deloitte Consulting is launching its new brand. We are now Braxton, and we're in the launching process. We acquired Braxton from Braxton and Associates, which was an acquisition in 1984, and this was a European strategy firm. So just a little bit of background information. What I'm going to share with you today is some market perspectives, integration challenges, and critical success factors surrounding the Department of Homeland Security. And these, we're going to address this from a couple of different perspectives. One, some research that we executed with our partner Aviation Week surrounding what the public and private sector was viewing as critical. And then we're also going to share with you what we see as the integration challenges and critical success factors based on an additional piece of research that's been executed around how do you make, complex mergers successful. So with that, let me take you through our agenda. So I said we'll take you through the market perspectives, we'll take you through integration challenges, critical success factors, and then we'll wrap it up. Now, market perspectives. The hard thing with Homeland Security, well, there's several hard things. One, the topic itself. Number two, the fact that we're dealing in a time of change. And to try to develop a perspective on, what's really going on and what does it mean to those of us in the private sector, in the state and local government sector, and in the federal sector. The issue that we had in trying to even initially start developing some market perspectives is there was no good data. So what we agreed to do was some market research, and we agreed to do it for a couple of reasons. Number one, our clients had come to us and said, we're confused. We don't really know what should be our highest priority. Help us understand what we should be focusing on. And that was true in the case of the private sector and, the public sector. And then what we found was that Aviation Week's subscriber base was doing the same. Now, that was primarily private sector, but again, what do we do? What's most important? How do we serve? So we felt that it was important for just those two communities, but we also felt it was important to provide the federal government and our state and local governments a perspective on what the pulse is around Homeland Security. So that's what we agreed to do. So our goal in executing this research was to really provide a better definition of Homeland Security. And in the report that you've received, and you will see that definition, we also wanted to understand what Homeland Security solutions, what categories there really were, and identify specific factors that might impact those solutions. Our approach was a combination of interview, survey, and research, and we did actually survey or interview a population of over 300 security professionals that were closest to Homeland Security in their organization. We analyzed key trends, we tried to separate hype from reality, and we reviewed emerging products and technologies. Now, of the total participants, 57% were public sector, with the majority of that being state and local, and 43% were private sector, the majority being Fortune 1000. Each survey was very complex. We asked people to do a lot, had about 400 data points. And we assembled that information over the course of really a 2-month period. So it gives you a feel for how aggressive and how difficult this was. And what we did our belief is it's very difficult to conduct any research if you don't have some sort of framework that you can put around it. So our initial efforts really focused on what are the key threat areas. They look a little bit different than what you'll see in the President's National Strategy for Homeland Security. However, when you really look at infrastructure, I think you'll see that they correlate fairly well. So we had 8 Homeland Security threat areas that we were specifically interested in understanding: border integrity, financial systems, physical infrastructure, IT and communications, public health integrity, transportation, natural resources, and then the wild card, weapons of mass destruction and disruption. And then also to frame research, because it's very difficult to ask generic questions, we decided that we'd come up with an initial set of security solution areas for our survey and interview respondents to comment on. And those included communications, health management, information assurance, integration, inventory management, physical security, privacy and legal services, response management, surveillance and intelligence, and training and education. Now, note on this one that really privacy and legal services were sort of a wild card. We weren't seeing much about that. We're starting to see a little bit more now, but we threw that in because we wanted to get a sense of what we might find. And we found some interesting findings as a result of executing the research and the surveys. And that is that the immediate focus between the public and the private sectors was on a different set of threats. For the public sector, 31% were focused on weapons of mass destruction, 27% on public health, 15% on physical infrastructure as the priority. These are the priority threats where we really should be focused. The private sector had a different focus, and I'm going to share with you why. But the private sector came back with transportation and IT communications both being equally a priority, and then weapons of mass destruction were a priority. But really what you see is the difference between the public sector and the private sector. The public is focused on the public. And so that's why we see public health, the physical infrastructure and the weapons of mass destruction. And the private sector really appears to be focused on ensuring continuity of the supply chain, making sure that they understand that their employees are going to be are going to be safe, and the likes. So that gives you a sense of what this is telling us. And remember, it's one snapshot at one point in time. With the development of the new department, with the development of the National Strategy for Homeland Security, we will see changes in how the public and the private sector view priorities. Now, providing you with another chart that provides a perspective on public and private sector solution priorities. And they're intriguing because, again, it shows you the focus on the public versus the focus on, more internal supply chain continuity and business continuity. State priorities are number 1, and this is state, health management, number 2, response management, and number 3, surveillance and intelligence. Local priorities are number 1, response management, number 2, security and protection, and number 3, education and awareness. So you see the difference in just even the state versus local focus in what made up the public sector bar. And then for private sector, priorities really are number 1, security and protection, number 2, surveillance and intelligence, and number 3, facilitating integration. So again, from a state and local standpoint, the focus is on the public. And that was pretty clear in interviews and the comments that we've received back. Whereas private sector, having gone through such a major disruption itself, was really focused on how do I make sure that my business can continue to operate, that I know where my employees are, and that I know how to communicate out to my suppliers and the likes. Another note just about the private sector. The private sector actually owns 85% of the total infrastructure in the United States. So the focus on surveillance and intelligence is not unsurprising. You know, when we first got the response, we spent a little time looking at it and saying, does this make sense? But when we went back and reviewed the drivers of that, it made a lot more sense. I'm going to show you a chart that did not come up, which is fine. The overall spending on Homeland Security is projected to be, now this is a conservative estimate, a very conservative estimate. But based on our analysis, and I'll take you through how we got here, the overall spending on Homeland Security is projected to be between $93 billion and $138 billion for fiscal year 2003. State priorities are really, again, remember, state priorities are, again, health management, response management, surveillance, and intelligence. State government is predicting that they are going to invest between $5 billion and $10 billion in Homeland Security solutions. Now, how did we get that number? Well, we asked the state government parties that were responding to tell us how they plan to budget a dollar across Homeland Security, and we also asked them to tell us what investment they were going to be making in Homeland Security. So with those two pieces of data, we were then able to go back and look at state budgets over, I believe, from 1999. We were able to apply an inflationary rate of 3%, and we were able to compute or extrapolate what the low band and the high band was going to be. And again, we asked them to give us a low investment range and a high investment range, and we asked them to tell us what that would be for 2003, 2004, and 2005. So that's how we came up with that number. That same approach applies to local government. For the federal government, we did nothing to the number other than cleanse it of the $5.1 billion that was already committed to state and local, or it was directed to state and local activities. So that's the 32.6 versus $37.7 billion number that you'll hear. Local government, again, $10 billion to $20 billion projected in spend. And why is that higher? That's where your first responder is. And then private sector, kind of a surprising number of $46 billion to $76 billion on the conservative side. Private sector was computed by, again, the same sets of questions. What is your investment going to be fiscal year 3, 4, and 5? What's the low range? What's the high range? And then what we did, we took SG&A for the Fortune 1000 companies for 2001, and we computed based on that. So when you think about it in terms of SG&A may be higher, we did not really apply an inflationary factor, but the fact that we just focused on the Fortune 1000 should tell you that this is definitely a national investment that we're going to be looking at, where only a portion of that investment is going to be driven by federal and state and local. We have already received a letter from Senator Christopher Bond of the Subcommittee on Small Business Development indicating that they want us to get a better feel for what the total implication is across the small business sector. So we're going to be working to try to respond to that. Okay. A little bit of an eye chart, but what you'll see here is, at least based on the pulse that we took back in the March through May period of time, the public sector perceived a fairly significant investment in Homeland Security for the year 2003. So you see that 20% of the public sector respondents that were interviewed anticipated that their operating budget for Homeland Security that Homeland Security would represent 5% of their total operating budget. And you see that in fiscal year 05, that levels off, that it becomes much more of a maintenance, where the majority or all of the public sector was telling us that their budget would be somewhere between 1% and 5%. You're going to have some that they're showing 0. Private sector looked at this a little bit differently. Again, 85% of the infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So we're looking at 40% of private sector respondents indicating that they anticipated they would invest 5% of their operating budgets to address Homeland Security. You do see leveling off then in fiscal year 04. of that 5% investment. But then you see in fiscal year 05 sort of a renewed investment at that greater than 5% level anticipated by the private sector. We believe that this is due to some of the realities that the private sector companies find themselves dealing with, where they address a solution to a problem, they implement it, they learn from it, and they realize that they need to either renew that investment or improve that investment. So we believe that that's what this chart is telling us. Regardless of what the state and local and private sector companies and our federal interviewees came back and told us, regardless of source, in general, all threat areas were perceived as requiring additional investing above the funding levels, currently available, with the exception of financial systems integrity, which was a surprise to me. I didn't anticipate that, but basically there is no single threat that is perceived as being adequately funded across the private sector and the public sector. IT communications is one of the areas considered to be most significantly underfunded, and along with border integrity. So those from a public sector and a private sector perspective, they believe that additional investment was needed there. Now, there are some significant barriers that our survey respondents came back and told us as well. They came back, first of all, and they said funding is an issue. 31% of the survey respondents believed that funding was a significant barrier. More than 50% of the respondents believe that federal government is not spending enough to counter threats. And government officials themselves have expressed concern about how effectively the money will be spent to provide security. So that is clearly a barrier and will remain a barrier, at least for the near term. Federal policy was considered to be the next most significant barrier to success, with 23% of the survey population indicating that they considered the barrier significant in addressing Homeland Security solutions. And finally, organization structure and politics represented the final two top barriers to success at 10% each. The greatest, with that telling us that the greatest challenge lies in establishing more of an enterprise approach across solutions and organizations. So it's an intriguing outlook. I think it tends to parallel a little bit of what we heard this morning, and I think we'll continue to see this develop. What we learned, and we learned a lot of things from doing research that was frankly this difficult, is we learned that there is a sense of immediacy right now, but we think that there is an outlook that we should expect to see over the course of the next 3 years or so. With fiscal year 03 really being a focus on immediacy, a focus on spot solutions, a focus on equipment, a focus on HR, communications, obviously now a focus on this new department. We believe that in fiscal year 04, we will see some leveling on the spend and the investment. Maintenance will clearly become more of the investment that we're making, but what we're going to see in fiscal year 04 is an even stronger call for integration. We think that in fiscal year 05, we will see structuring begin to happen, where we'll start seeing an opportunity to consolidate. More oversight will be provided, and standardization will certainly come into play. And then we think that in fiscal year 05, we will also see solution convergence. Now, this market outlook was developed, prior to June 6th, with the announcement of the new Department of Homeland Security. So we are in the process of actually going back and trying to understand whether or not, this outlook is correct. Certainly there's certainly aspects of it are. A lot will depend on how quickly the new department is stood up and how quickly it begins operating as an integrated enterprise. A couple of other just key points I want to leave with you on this slide. As this is a national problem, it is critical that from a state and local perspective and a federal and a private level perspective, that we continue to challenge whether or not we are creating and offering redundant solutions, whether or not they're going to be interoperable, whether or not we really are going to attain the maximum security value on our investment. And so as we look at this, I think we should all be challenging ourselves on moving forward with the structuring, moving forward with convergence, and ensuring that we approach this national problem as a national investment that we really want to see value from. I was told this slide builds out a little bit. It was interesting, Mr. Hoagland's description of the different areas across the threat spectrum somewhat parallel what we determined as a result of our research, but I wanted to provide you with some insight on what we see as the threat spectrum. And we think that buyers and providers should consider the entire threat spectrum in developing and implementing solutions. You certainly have a threat avoidance side of the spectrum, and you have an impact management side of the spectrum, and then we viewed it as an impact mitigation with a 6-step continuum that is designed to support the threat spectrum from detection through prevention, preparation, event management, response, recovery, and deterrence. And one of the things we were asked to do when we did our research was to try to get a sense of where could the private sector help. And so we asked our survey respondents, and so again, this included private sector and public sector, which industries were well positioned to meet the solution requirements. And there were 5, and they are not in any order. Aerospace and defense was considered to be pretty critical in enhancing surveillance and intelligence, reinforcing security and protection, and improving response management. Whereas the media was really viewed as a partner that could assist in helping to improve education and awareness, improve communications and public alerts, and to strengthen information assurance. Systems integrators were viewed as key enablers for facilitating integration, again, information assurance, and helping to improve response management. And security firms were tapped as those that could help support reinforcing security and protection, surveillance, intelligence, and improving overall response management. And then finally, last but not least by any sense, wireless and communications firms were considered to be key partners in improving our national communications and public alert systems, strengthening information assurance, and enhancing surveillance and intelligence. So that gives you a snapshot of the report. The report goes into a fair amount of detail. Be happy to take any questions as we wrap up or through email later. But let me share with you some of the integration challenges that we see going forward with the new Department of Homeland Security. A couple of points. This is probably the most complex merger there is. We've been studying it. We've been trying to determine, is there another case study that looks like it? But it is somewhat unique. It is also a merger that's going to have to go through evolution. From our perspective, as we look at mergers and this new department, there probably is no right or a wrong at this juncture. It's too early to tell. So from our perspective, we as a nation need to declare scope on this new department, declare organization, and move forward, and we'll evolve it across time. Now, why is this the most complex, certainly government reorganization? You've heard that from many. But why is it probably the most complex merger? Well, number one, it's large and it's complex. At least 22 distinct, fairly large entities, 170,000 employees, a mix of partial and or full agency reorganization. So in some cases, parts of organizations are being pulled out of an existing agency. In other cases, the full agency is moving over to the new department, or it should be moving over to the new department. There are disparate missions, cultures, processes, and technologies that are in place within all of these agencies. So that just gives you a sense of what we're looking at. Now let's talk about the benefits and why it's complex from a benefit perspective. Well, number one, if you look at it, its mission is to provide security. Okay? So it's critical that that benefit be realized, but it's a very difficult benefit to even quantify. You have to address more control and authority. We're going to have to address operational efficiencies. You know, they've got a target of reducing redundant spending. They need to manage R&D spending effectively. They need to optimize the asset utilization, create single sources of communication. So those target improvements are highly complex in and of themselves. And then we need to mitigate risk. So we can't lose focus on security while integrating. This, again, this new cabinet, we internally we call it NewCab. NewCab has probably the broadest stakeholder community of any private sector organization as we know it. In this case, we're dealing with citizens, we're dealing with state and local governments, private sector entities, federal government employees, and the suppliers and contractors that serve the federal government. So that is the stakeholder community. So it's complex, we have to manage the risk. And we can't lose focus on security while integrating. We have to manage the risk that we actually could cripple integration due to just perceived political differences and redefined levels of authority. We have to mitigate the risk that we might lose confidence with the public, and that's a key one that needs to be managed. We might have some strategic misalignment that we need to manage. We have to manage the risk of inefficient communications and information flow, and we have to manage the overall risk that we may not capture the benefits. So this is the target, and hopefully I've given you a sense of complexity, because it is complex. Now, it's complex. And the strategy has been provided. That strategy is important. Implementation really is where the devil in the detail is. It is pivotal to success. If you think about the desired outcomes that we're looking for, we need to reinvent, redefine, and strengthen core functions and processes around Homeland Security. We need to capture recurring annual integration savings. We need to develop a portable and flexible organization, and then we have to rapidly execute an issue-free day one. Now, that's our internal definition around the first day that a new organization offers itself as a fully functioning organization to the world. Okay? Now, what have we found? Again, it's all about implementation. In 70% of the cases of large-scale merger and integrations, we have found that the synergies that were initially targeted were not achieved. 47% of executives leave by the first year, and 75% leave within the third year. And there's normally, in these mergers, there actually is a productivity reduction by 50% within the first 4 to 8 months of operation. So when you think about it, again, the principal challenge in trying to figure out how to make this new Department of Homeland Security work effectively is, first of all, what are the synergies and how do you capture them? How do you do this while integrating systems, processes, employees, management, suppliers, and external stakeholders? While you're building a strategic platform, which is a new business model, a new value proposition, new processes, and new organization, and doing all of this without negatively impacting your employees, your external stakeholders, your vendors, and your suppliers, and your financial performance. So it's not, the whole issue of integration and this merger is not conceptually difficult, but it requires a ruthless focus on priorities, a ruthless focus on execution, and a speed that is designed to deliver, or at a speed that's designed to deliver. I don't expect you to be able to read this next chart, but there are many mechanisms that the new department can use to mitigate potential negative impacts. Again, with the challenges being stabilization, integration scope and scale, operations integration, cultural assimilation, resource commitment, benefit realization, day one readiness, and post-day one momentum. When you think about the different challenges, let me read a few types of impacts that we could have if any one of these challenges is really not managed very well. Let's say cultural assimilation is not managed well. What could happen? You could actually have residual mistrust linger, and that can create an environment of non-cooperation. So you need to plan for that as we're standing up, a new department. So what mechanisms can address the challenges? Well, and I'm going to read a few of them. First of all, a performance-based retention program for staff. That's been our experience in the private sector, and this does look, aspects of this new department look more like, a private sector organization than they look like a public sector organization. Clearly executive leadership and a staged and sequenced work plan, and we'd submit to you that this is a series of work plans. Performance-based accountability, and an overall culture alignment roadmap. I mentioned to you ruthless prioritization, so yes, and this is actually one of the mechanisms to address it. Dedicated and committed resources. From a benefits perspective, stretch targets and then continuous benefit tracking. From a day one readiness, we've got to get down to must-have versus nice-to-have differentiation, and we need to understand where we have long lead times and how to accelerate them. And then from a post-day one, some pretty rigorous initiative tracking and status reporting needs to be in place, and also performance incentives. Again, I just want to stress to you that when you think about the number of stakeholders, the real risk we have in standing up a new department is just making sure that we manage the expectations of each of the stakeholders. This new department is certainly going to be a legacy of the administration, and I would like to see, a year from now, 5 years from now, that we are proud of the investment that we are making as a nation. So what are the critical success factors? This is, again, it's based on a combination, these summary slides are based on a combination of what we've learned from the survey and then what we've learned by reviewing complex mergers. The first critical success factor that we believe is clear is one of intergovernmental coordination. The benefits of ensuring that we have that in place are that we would be ensuring adequate geographic and mission coverage. We would be providing a more rapid and, even more importantly, a more concerted response. We can leverage the resources, the skills across the different sectors, and the information that's available. And as important, we can reduce duplicative effort. Now, there are some challenges in doing this. It's complex. And it's not going to get any less complex probably for a period of time until we really begin seeing the new department emerge. But if you just take this one example, and it's just illustrative, the fact that you're going to have a joint terrorism task force, and then we have the state Homeland Security task force, means that you now have two task forces that may need to work together. It also is further complicated in that you have different types of expertise that are available within the different sectors. So, for example, Homeland Security leads in the states, are National Guard, lieutenant governors, and attorney generals. And that's very different, from the types of folks that are involved in the FBI and the CIA that might be part of helping us to execute this joint terrorism task force. So it's just a feel for, you got a whole bunch of different stakeholders involved here that have to work together. Now, systems integration, I'm going to make a couple of comments on this. Systems integration is certainly a critical success factor, but we can't, based on what we've read, what we've learned, what our survey respondents told us, integration by itself is not going to be enough. And certainly integration, and certainly when you're looking at integration, if your ultimate goal is good information, then you really need to purpose the information as part of your integration effort. Otherwise, what you're going to have is very little new to work with. So systems integration is important, but again, it has to be thoughtfully executed. The benefits, are certainly quick access to relevant and appropriate information, consistent and accurate information, better alert integration and dissemination. And even a key benefit is, what information don't I have? So that's one of the key benefits you can get from this. Challenges. The funding required is not minor. Common standards, and again, we believe that the private sector has to be key in helping to address some of this. Outdated legacy systems, information assurance in general, training, and then privacy protection. And when you look at this linking of databases, if we really envision a future, you could see this extended much more into the private sector as well. So it's a puzzle that needs to be thought through. It's a puzzle that we're going to have to work through together, and it's going to be a challenge. Public and private cooperation is the next critical success factor, and I think we all understand the need for that. And there are some clear benefits. And our survey told us that there was a desire to see more public-private cooperation. The benefits include more Homeland Security influence on the research and development agenda, improving the potential for more rapid adoption of cutting-edge science and technology. You can mobilize more rapidly. You can recover more quickly. Certainly a benefit is that you can gain a complementary focus on the threats instead of siloed focus on threats. And you can access specialized information and skills. There are some challenges here as well as a nation. How do you protect the intellectual capital across the different sectors? How do you deal with the cultural differences? How do you deal with the business priorities and the government priorities? And how do you deal with cost sharing? That's probably the most problematic. But we've given you two illustrations on this chart that show how you might, very simply, address prevention and response as an integrated, overall cooperative model. And we think long term that's the type of model that we're going to have to get closer to. Probably the most important slide that I want to leave you with for critical success factors. And again, I hope I've shared with you that from a stakeholder standpoint, this is absolutely the most complex, challenging type of environment that we're going to be dealing with. It is a legacy. We need to position it so that it can meet and exceed expectations. Now, to do that, we really need to identify how we're going to quantify and measure security value. So this is just one illustration. It is not the illustration, but it could be something like how well have we prevented terrorist attacks, how well have we minimized the damage from attacks, how have we recovered from attacks that do occur, and how do we reduce overall vulnerability, and then have a series of metrics within each of those. Regardless of what the ultimate metrics are, they're important. They're important to manage the expectations of the citizens, they're important to manage the expectations of state and local, and they're important for the federal government to manage their own value and their own benefit. The benefits, certainly could offer quantifiable and objective measures by taking this approach. It certainly would allow better informed management decisions. And again, that whole issue of security return on investment is important here. It can help us identify gaps and where we need to improve. It can help us prioritize where we allocate our resources as a nation. Again, not just federal, but state and local and private sector as well. And then it helps enforce accountability. So we think this is going to be critical. There are challenges. How do you measure security? That's probably the biggest challenge. You have to develop the tracking system, and obviously you have to work across the different cultures to gain consensus. But we think that once we move forward with this type of program, then we can all talk in more of the same language in terms of how's the new department doing. Finally, you need to manage risk, and Mr. Hoagland certainly addressed this in his discussion. But again, from our perspective, you need to think of it in terms of what is the specific threat, what is the specific risk, what is the potential impact to our nation. We need to make sure that we're focused on where it falls in the threat spectrum, and we need to make sure that we can quantify it. But from a risk management standpoint, there clearly are key benefits. Number one, you can prioritize the use of limited resources by balancing risk and security value. But I keep coming back to how do you know what is the most important? At some point in time, we're going to have to understand security value returned. So we need to understand risk, security value returned, and then we need to obviously understand how it plays across the threat spectrum. From a challenges standpoint, again, the hardest thing with Homeland Security, at least in analyzing it from a finance perspective, is how do you determine the security value of each dollar spent? And the whole issue around, the perception of risk is subjective. We found that was very different views from a public sector and a private sector standpoint already. We didn't even take the survey down to the citizen level, so I know we'd get some differing views there. So, perceived risk is subjective. It's difficult to quantify, and you need enough information to be able to quantify it well. So these are just some of the critical success factors, again, that we think we're going to be looking at in standing up the new department. I guess in conclusion, I'll share with you that from our perspective, this is a large and complex issue. I'm not saying anything that someone else has not already said. But it has the most diverse set of stakeholders of any really other public sector or private sector component. We all certainly look to the IRS, but when you look at Homeland Security and the role that the private citizen has to play, and the role that the public sector, state and local governments have to play, and the role that the private industry has to play, it's very complex. The key to successful integration is implementation. Strategy's good. Implementation is everything. And then finally, intergovernmental coordination, public and private cooperation, performance management and accountability, risk management, and systems integration are paramount. And with that, I thank you, and don't know if you want me to try to take any questions.
We have time for questions.
Happened the last time.
Yes, you answered all of the questions. Thank you very much, Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for your excellent presentation. If I could ask David Spites and Martha Stansel-Gam to join us at the front. Welcome.
Thank you. You want to go first, or?
I'm going to introduce Doc first, and then he'll introduce you. There's still a couple of seats up front for people in the back that may have difficult seeing. A multitude of federal agencies now comprise the U.S. government's efforts to protect the homeland and combat terrorism. At each briefing, we will highlight the Homeland Security programs of 2 or 3 federal agencies. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Pat Allen Pentland as the moderator of today's session on Homeland Security programs. Dr. Pentland is a senior national security analyst and the associate director of the Aerospace Center with the Strategies Group of Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC. Dr. Pentland has extensive experience in all areas of federal national security policy and defense planning and operations. Prior to joining SAIC, Dr. Pentland served as the study group coordinator for the United States Commission on National Security, otherwise known as the Hart-Rudman Commission. The President and Congress created the Commission in 1998 to perform the most thorough review of U.S. national security strategy, structures, and processes since the 1947 National Security Act, which created the current Department of Defense. The Commission's findings formed, among other accomplishments, the blueprint for the Department of Homeland Security. Dr. Pentland developed the study methodology and work plans for the Commission. He supervised the study group that supported the Commission, supervised and conducted the Commission's research, and helped to write and edit several of the Commission's key reports. The final report recommended sweeping changes to U.S. government national security structures and processes. Key recommendations were made that pertain to Homeland Security, which have been acted on by the administration and Congress. In addition, Dr. Pentland has drafted congressional testimony for the Hart-Rudman commissioners for numerous House and Senate hearings on Homeland Security. Dr. Pentland holds a top secret clearance and is currently assigned to SAIC's Strategies Group. He is responsible for conducting a broad range of research that involves strategy, force structure, planning, programming, operations, acquisition, and analysis. He is at present a member of Task Force Enduring Look, which is the U.S. Air Force's official effort to document and capture the stories and lessons learned from Operation Enduring Freedom. Dr. Pentland is under contract as the lead analyst for the Afghanistan phase of operations. He is responsible for the research and analysis effort, as well as report composition and editing. As a member of SAIC Strategies Group, Dr. Pentland's insights and experience have proven invaluable to SAIC's Homeland Security Task Force and to SAIC's National Security Centers of Excellence. Through its strategy development, policy planning analysis, knowledge management, architecture, and an integrated solutions experience, SAIC is fully committed to comprehensive U.S. Homeland Security strategy and implementation. With the focus on integration of skills, resources, cultures, and disciplines, SAIC is helping to transform America's Homeland Security. Welcome, Doc.
Thank you. Blush a little bit. You can tell how poor my essay was that I came up for the wrong session. First, I'm glad to see so many people here finally interested in Homeland Security. We had trouble filling this room when the Commission was releasing some of its reports. I'm especially now, though, pleased to see an interest in an organizational solution that was originally offered by the Hart-Rudman Commission. Frankly, I did not believe that I would ever see a Department of Homeland Security created because the overwhelming tendency in this town was to do the possible and create a czar rather than do what was necessary. I do agree with some of the previous speakers that Homeland Security is not just a federal responsibility. A great deal of Homeland Security rests upon the state, local, and the private sector. However, there will be a huge tendency by that state, local, and private sector to look at the federal government as a gigantic ATM machine to fill some of their needs. I do disagree with one of the first speakers where he talked about just rearranging the boxes. People that are concerned with rearranging the boxes remind me of those people that want to rearrange deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic. And what the Department of Homeland Security will do will be to provide that structure that we need to move into the future, and there will be a lot of difficulty setting it up. The Commission had no glassy eyeballs about how easy a job it would be. We knew it would be a difficult task, but we also believed that the sooner we moved ahead doing it, the better off that we would be. There is a misnomer out there, I believe, that the Department of Homeland Security is a counterterrorism department. It is not a counterterrorism department. It is a Department of Homeland Security. It extends much beyond just counterterrorism. If you look at some of the major functions that the government does at the executive level, you'll see some major lines in the road that do overlap with some of this department. There's the international aspects associated with dealing with some of the counterterrorism aspects and counterproliferation overseas of the State Department and the Defense Department. There's a law enforcement aspect that obviously this department should not be the main law enforcement mechanism. And there's some medical areas. The key is to look at the strategic integration of what this department does at the interagency level as a strategic integration issue, some of which and a great deal of which is counterterrorism, but a lot of things that the department does is not just counterterrorism. But what the department will do is provide an operational focus to be able to execute some of those key missions that are laid out in the President's strategy for national homeland security. And you need that operational organization to be able to do that. Military equivalent would be like trying to go fight Afghanistan with a separate Air Force, a separate Marine Corps, separate SOF, separate Navy, without a DOD. How far do you think we would have gotten? You won't. And so we need to institutionalize what we're going to do if we're going to see progress. The purpose of this panel, of course, is to discuss some of the programs and procurements that are associated with Homeland Security, and obviously not just in the new department, but in other areas there. We do have a couple of panelists from many career fields. And our first speaker is going to be David Spikes. Did I get that correct? Yeah, okay. David is the Associate Director of the Chemical Emergency Preparedness and Prevention Office. And he has spent 30 years dealing with state, the federal, and at the local level. He's currently, of course, assigned to the Environmental Protection Agency. Prior to that, he has extensive experience in the National Response Team and the National Contingency Plan. And without further ado, David.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try to talk a little bit with you this morning about EPA's role in Homeland Security and in counterterrorism efforts, and also talk a little bit about some of the funding that's available that will be both used directly by EPA and also made available to others, including possibly the private sector. Usually when I talk about Homeland Security or counterterrorism with friends, or even in settings such as this, most people's first question is, well, what does EPA do in counterterrorism? And what in the world does an agency with a flower for symbol have to do with helping fight a war? We basically have two fundamental areas, and the first one I usually describe as what do you think is going to happen in the aftermath of a terrorist event? Who do you think is going to clean up the mess? And that is where EPA's role falls directly, is in the emergency response, in the cleanup and decontamination. Now, most of you probably were pretty aware of this in the aftermath of the World Trade Center and also the Capitol Hill contamination. EPA was involved heavily, and still is to some degree, in both of those, and also with the post office in cleaning up the anthrax contamination there. I think they were running a test this weekend at the Brentwood facility of the first decon there, and I think the next move after that will be moving on to some of the facilities in New Jersey. EPA plays a major role in that. For several years, we've been trying to build up our capability for emergency response to deal with terrorist events, particularly because of what we saw in the wake of 9/11. We usually are dealing with some fairly exotic materials and unusual situations. The World Trade Center, there was constant demand for monitoring of the air and water and the debris to make sure that it was safe for people, for workers, for people in the vicinity. We're now looking at still examining some of the debris that was hauled off to the Fresh Kills facility, and it is still being sifted and gone through for evidence and for remains and for other reasons. And also we're looking at some of the actual residences in the vicinity of the World Trade Center to help assure the people who are living there that it's a safe place for them to continue to live and work. So EPA has that as a fundamental responsibility. As I said, for several years we've been trying to build that capability. Our emergency responders are very used to dealing with oil spills and with hazardous materials, but some of the things we anticipate encountering are going to be fairly, as I said, exotic, and we need special talent, special equipment, special training to be able to cope with that. So a good part of the O2 supplemental has recently been approved, and also the FY03 budget has been devoted to enhancing EPA's emergency response capability. Provided us with new staff, new contract, additional funding for contract support. In general, we're going to be putting that mostly with existing contractors, but in the future there may be some new opportunities there. Purchasing detection equipment, both for chemical and biologicals, and also for training our responders and our contractors. We're also in the 03 budget getting some money for research and development and decontamination. I think the lessons learned, particularly from the anthrax events and the situation on Capitol Hill, is that while we were able to mount a successful decontamination operation there, we have a lot to learn. And there are probably better ways to do it, quicker ways to do it, more efficient ways to do it, more effective ways to do it. And so EPA has been given, under the President's budget, and I think in the most recent Senate markup, about $50 million next year to do research and development into decontamination. And as I said, the rest of the money that's being appropriated to EPA for next year, I think is about $35 million, and that will be devoted mostly to emergency response for our staff, for to enhance our staff, and for equipment and training. Our second major area that EPA is involved in is the site security of both water facilities and chemical facilities. I'll start first with the water facilities. It's not my area of expertise. We work very closely with our colleagues in the Office of Water. But in the recently passed Bioterrorism Act, there was a special section, I think, initiated by Congressman Tozan and Dingell in particular, to ensure the security of the nation's water supplies. So it's mainly focused on drinking water facilities. The approach that was chosen, EPA had already begun this with its own funding and with funding provided by the Congress, of course, with our own grant mechanism was to provide some support to drinking water facilities to begin doing what is known as a vulnerability assessment and then taking steps to address those vulnerabilities. Much of this had begun before 9/11. There was an awareness that our drinking water supplies could be in danger from potential terrorist attack. And therefore, EPA had already begun working with Sandia Laboratories to develop a methodology for assessing vulnerabilities. That's been in place. We have done training of a number of both public and private sector trainers in how to conduct those kind of methodologies. And we're now in the process through the supplemental providing significant amounts of funding to both large and then small and medium drinking water facilities to conduct those assessments and then begin the work of addressing those vulnerabilities. I think in the O2 supplemental we have something like $89 million. Much of that, as I said, 50 or so million, I think, is going to large drinking water facilities. I think that's those serving, not sure of the figure, but 100,000 or more people. And then the other funding is going mainly to support the small and medium ones. Now, this money goes directly to those facilities. Many of them are publicly owned by state and local governments, but in turn, they will probably be using it to conduct those assessments and also to bolster their preparedness and prevention and security measures for terrorist attack. And so there may be some business opportunities for some of you who may be in that business or wish to get into that business. I think there's similar kinds of monies appropriated in the 03 budget for that kind of activity as well. Jumping back just a minute, I failed to mention that where the real money is on emergency response in the future is going to be with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and which will become part of the Department of Homeland Security. The President's FY03 budget contains $3.5 billion, yes, that's the B word, $1 billion for first responders across the country to enhance, again, their preparedness, their equipment, and their training. So a lot of money, assuming that that moves through the congressional appropriation process, will be available through FEMA or eventually the Department of Homeland Security, assuming that that takes place before the next fiscal year. By the way, our office is working very closely with FEMA in that we have a strong relationship with state and local responders for dealing with hazardous materials and oil spills in particular. And so some of the expertise that we have or that we will be developing for dealing with these exotic chemicals, we are hopeful to be able to assist FEMA in providing that assistance to state and local governments. Under the site security area, the other major area that we'll be involved in is with chemical facilities across the United States. The Department of Transportation is certainly working to bolster the transportation networks and their security for transportation of hazardous materials. I think a fact I learned the other day is there are about 800,000 shipments a day of hazardous materials in the United States. Some of them are quite small. They're about less than half of those probably are required to have the placarding and manifest and things of that nature that DOT requires. 100,000 of those are gasoline, but they're huge amounts of hazardous materials moving across our roads and via water and air, and that certainly is something that DOT is focusing on protecting. EPA, on the other hand, with the Department of Energy and OSHA and others, will be focusing on the fixed facilities, the chemical plants, and facilities that actually handle chemicals but may not think of themselves as being in the chemical business. EPA has developed a set of principles that we think are important for chemical site security. And these are very similar to what almost everyone who's worked in this arena has in this arena has agreed is needed. As I said, it's very similar to what we are doing in the water facilities. We're basically saying that key chemical facilities should conduct a vulnerability assessment, then they should take actions, concrete actions to address those vulnerabilities. They should work with state and local law enforcement and first responders and emergency planners and local emergency planning committees in the development of those actions. And they should have some sort of oversight process, including the possibility of third-party audits, which some of you may be interested in conducting. EPA is advocating the use of third-party audits for our in-place chemical safety program under our risk management program. The EPA principles have not been officially rolled out. We're still negotiating and working that through the administration for how we will present them. They've been talked about quite extensively, both in the main press and in the trade press. But you also may be aware that industry is taking actions on its own. The American Chemistry Council, for example, has developed guidance to its facilities on actions they should be taking for chemical site security. They've adopted it as a new code as part of their responsible care code. They're making it a mandatory requirement for membership. Other trade associations are doing similar kinds of things. But there has been some call for some form of government role and government oversight. As recently as last week, the Senate Environment and Public Health Committee approved Senate Bill 1620, originally introduced by Senator Corzine and co-sponsored by several others. I think it was approved by a unanimous 19-0 vote last Thursday, which would require EPA to basically make the kind of program I was talking about a few minutes ago that is being done voluntarily and the kind that's laid out in our principles, a mandatory one that EPA would have a strong oversight role in. We don't know at this stage what the future of that piece of legislation is, but there's been talk that it may be added as an amendment to the legislation creating the Department of Homeland Security. That's pretty much the state of the Homeland Security activities at EPA. There are a number of other lesser things that are going on. Our Criminal Investigation Division works very closely with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and others in dealing with the possibility of criminal acts involving environmental crimes. And we have a number of other things that are probably of less interest to you. So I think I will stop there. And do you entertain questions here or at the end of the panel, or how do you prefer? At the end of the panel. End of the panel. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Martha Stencil-Gamm. She's chief of the Justice Department's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section, which she joined in 1991. Prior to that, I guess Marty was a judge advocate of the United States Air Force, okay, where she served in both prosecutor and defense and taught at the JAG school. Was that down at Maxwell? Okay, all right. And also taught or was involved in international law at Pacific Air Forces and at U.S. Pacific Com. Her current duties includes investigations and prosecutions, law enforcement training, and international work, as well as advising the federal sector on a broad range of information technology. She has been teaching and has at the Harvard Trial Advocacy Workshop, and so she has been involved in all aspects of law enforcement dealing with computer crime, from actually catching them, prosecuting them in the field, to teaching it, and to improving methods of it. Marty?
Good morning. It's become almost a truism that one of the things we need to do better in protecting the country is share information. And we can say it and say it and say it, but getting people to do it, particularly to do it in ways that are effective, is a whole lot harder. It's a little bit like saying all we need is love. But what does it look like? Behaviorally, what do we need to do differently? It seems to me that in order to really make a difference and to change the way we behave, first of all, we have to make sure that we've diagnosed the problem accurately. I hear all the time that the big problem is sharing information between the public and the private sector. It's not that simple. It's not nearly that simple. That's the bad news. The good news is I have seen it work, and others have seen it work as well. And so we know what it looks like when things are working better. First of all, why isn't it that simple? Well, to say the problem is getting the public and the private sector to talk to each other implies that they are talking to themselves, and that's not true. There are lots of entities in the private sector that aren't talking to each other. And as a computer crime prosecutor, one of the things I can tell you is that industry as customer and industry as vendor of a certain product or service has a very different view about distributing information. If it is your product or service in which the vulnerability has occurred, generally your attitude is going to be much more conservative about sharing information than if you are a customer of that product or service. And so one of the things I say to industry audiences all the time is, you all need to figure out, by talking to each other, how you want that information distribution to work. Now understand, I'm talking about networks since that's the focus of my attention. But think about it from both directions. Reciprocity is hell, as we say in the international law business. How do you want it to work when it is your product or service that is the source of the vulnerability? To whom should that information go? Under what circumstances should it go? What are the restrictions and controls on that information? Information sharing isn't binary. It isn't all or nothing. So we need to begin to think about it in more nuanced ways. The same is also true when you are the customer. Now, how do you want information to be shared to you as the customer of the vulnerable product or service? And you have to find some happy, disciplined middle ground. Similarly, I think, as we may all be a little more aware, government isn't always great at talking to itself either. But I don't know that it is quite as simple as we've thought. In my view, the fault lines are not necessarily agency fault lines. They're discipline fault lines. If you listen to people talk after an information technology incident, an attack, let's say, what you'll hear people say is, well, is this really a technology problem? Is it a law enforcement problem? Is it an intelligence problem? Is it a warfighting problem? In fact, after some very successful interagency cases, I've stood up before technology audiences or groups of intelligence lawyers, and I've had them say to me, sort of through slitted eyes, are these really law enforcement cases or are these really intelligence cases? And my answer is yes, yes, they are both. They are both technology problems and law enforcement problems. We need to do both. So here are my thoughts about the things that are holding us back from sharing information more effectively and the specific things we could do to do a better job. First of all, even if you wanted to share information, it's a lot of work. Why is it a lot of work? Because it's not immediately apparent to us who might be able to make very productive use of that information, particularly outside our own discipline. Law enforcement is pretty good at talking to itself. Different agencies, state and locals, even across international borders. We work pretty effectively with our international counterparts. But even if we thought, who in the intelligence community needs to have this information? To whom would it make an immediate difference? We may not immediately know. The same is true in the technology community. If we wanted to share information with the technology community, how would we do that in ways that are disciplined without having the whole world know about it? Because I'll tell you, having the whole world know about it is is detrimental to the law enforcement mission. As soon as information about a pending law enforcement investigation goes in your publications or newscasts, hard drives with valuable evidence start hitting the bottom of the river. So there are very good reasons why law enforcement needs to maintain the integrity of an investigation while it is going on. How can we share information with our counterparts in technology without compromising our own mission? So, first of all, what we are trying to do in the Justice Department, and what I urge everybody else to do, is map your resources. If we were going to share information in more effective ways, to whom would it go? We are trying to make sure that we know where all of those places are in the Justice Department, and we are asking for that kind of information from our counterparts in industry and in government. If we were going to share information, to whom would it go? Be specific. Make sure that we understand the missions and functions of these different offices so that we can push the information out where it needs to go. So first we need to map to make sure it's not so much work, so we're not doing it ad hoc. Second, the big reason why people don't share information is the risk. When you share information, you lose control of it. You know, there is no guarantee that the person to whom you've given information isn't then going to give it to somebody else that you didn't have in mind at all. And it's not at all clear that the purposes for which you shared it are going to be honored. So it seems to me one of the things we need to do to reduce the risk of information sharing is we need to start behaving like a network. We need to create some information sharing protocols, a set of negotiated rules, particularly between disciplines, between law enforcement and the intelligence community, between both of those and the technology community, so that it will be clear to all of us as partners in a shared enterprise when we share information what those different entities are going to do with it, what the rules are, what the accepted uses are, and for what purposes they must come back to us and request specific permission. The last thing, well, no, sorry, there are two more. One is we need to also think about the reward structure, particularly in government, I think. You know, I've been in government a long time, and my observation is that government generally rewards star individual performers, whether you're talking about individual prosecutors or agencies. We love to get somebody up on a podium and let them take a star turn. That is certainly true at budget time when each agency wants to tout its individual accomplishments, because budget is, after all, a zero-sum game where the agencies are all competing with each other. So what this requires, I think, is some very creative thinking about how government is going to disfavor ball hogs and reward individuals and entities that are great team players, that do push information out where it needs to go. And finally, I think that one of the most important those that is holding us back is a vision of how this could work. Those of us who have worked in interagencies, multidisciplinary cases, have had a taste of how it can work. And when you see it work well, it's really exciting. It's wonderful because you realize as a group, you are accomplishing things that your discipline could not accomplish alone. So we've had the experience of seeing it work, but most agencies, most people haven't had that. And so what we need is a sense of how this network could operate and what the reciprocal general payoffs would be for everybody. As I said, you know, most of these groups have a tendency, because look, they understand their own powers, their own ways of looking at the world. They're very confident of the expertise and the value that they bring to these problems. Some of what we lack is just information and understanding about how the other groups, the technologists, the intelligence analysts, the value that they also bring to this enterprise. As a consequence, what happens naturally is, without an organizational structure, we have a tendency to fight for primacy. And as I said to an audience of military operators some years ago, when they said, why should we go to law enforcement to help protect our networks? My answer to them was, look at us respond to this problem. Wherever the ball goes, we are all over it. We look like 5-year-olds playing soccer. There's this little scrum that runs around the field wherever the ball happens to be. You are war fighters. You think of ones and zeros as munitions. I do not do what you do, but you don't do what I do. And I can bring some value to the protection of your networks. I can gather information. I can reach out to other entities with which you don't have connection. I don't want anybody to get off the field. I just want to spread out and play positions. So in sum, I think that a lot of what we have to do requires us to think about the edges of that team. Who's on the team? What functions are relevant? Who is performing those functions? How do we get information out to those offices, people, whether public or private, in ways that are most efficient and integrated? How do we do it at the same time in ways that are disciplined and that allow us, when our missions do collide a little bit, as sometimes they do, to negotiate that so that we can come up with a solution that makes the most sense for the national security? That's what we really need to do. So I guess all I would say to you is, listen critically when you hear those kinds of conversations taking place, when people say, isn't this really the problem rather than that? What I'd love to have everybody say is, that's like arguing which is more important, the shortstop or the catcher. It's a conversation that doesn't make any sense. We have to be able to do all of these things all at the same time, to integrate them, and to begin to take some real pleasure and pride in doing them together. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have about 10, 12 minutes for questions. And I'll go ahead and lead off with the first one, if you don't mind, and I'll address it to Dave on our EPA. We've heard a lot of comments and some as well in your presentation about what it really amounts to threat-based funding. What's the threat? Then let's go ahead and do the thing out there. Recently, over the last year, DOD has done an about-face and went away from threat-based funding, because trying to predict a particular terrorist threat or a particular threat is extremely difficult to do, to what they call capability-based funding. And do you think there might be any benefit in moving to looking at capabilities in terms of Homeland Security functions versus trying to cover all threats across the board?
To slide?
Yeah.
Well, I think we're trying to do a little bit of both. I guess defense probably is too. I mean, we try to analyze what conceivable threats are out there, and are we prepared to deal with them. Obviously, if you read the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, you saw an article, I think, on the federal page that talked about EPA's lessons learned report after 9/11. And we undertook a fairly strong self-critical analysis of our abilities to respond to that event. And looking forward, we're trying to build a capability to respond to several of those kind of events simultaneously. So we're looking sort of at threat-based, but at the same time, we're trying to build the core capability of the agency to do response. So I think we're doing a little bit of both.
Okay. Now we'll take questions from the floor, please. Way in the back.
EPA. Inherent in the task of site security for drinking water facilities is the ability to detect chem bio agents. Will the EPA manage a chem bio detection research program, or will it rely on the Army's programs at Edgewood, given that they share the information?
Well, I'm not sure I have the definitive answer on that one, but I think our approach there is we're going to try to work cooperatively with all the other assets in the federal government. And I know we do depend on the Army's program, particularly in the biological arena, and also the CDC, the Health and Human Services Department. There's several others that have these kind of capabilities, and I don't think we'll seek to duplicate them. We may supplement them. We may try to develop some internal capability, but for when you have these really sophisticated units, I think we're going to rely on those. We have been asked to develop a decon unit, and that's one particular unit that we think Homeland Security has asked us to do that. We think it's a unique niche, and so we're going to be building our capability in that in particular. Again, it's built on the experience we had on Capitol Hill. So I hope I'm answering your question. I think the answer is yes. We're going to use all the other assets in the federal government and elsewhere that we can.
Yes, ma'am.
That was an interesting presentation, but I think what you're suggesting is we may need a change in our culture in the government as to how information is shared, because you made some broad assumptions about how well information is shared now among the agencies and with state and local government that I'm not sure the public thinks is actually the case. But how do you recommend we go about encouraging information sharing, which is going to have to be shared with the new Department of Homeland Security, and have a culture change in the government that says, I can give up control of this information and for the benefit of the public? 30 seconds.
Well, and I think a lot of the failures to share information are just simply a lack of information about what other agencies or entities would do with it. You know, one of my favorite examples is a U.S. Attorney's Office that experienced an attempted intrusion, and the technologists in the office were working with technologists in Washington, but it didn't even occur to them to go to the specially trained prosecutor with whom we work all the time sitting down the hall. The information came to us through a rather circuitous route, and the first thing we did was call the prosecutor in that office. Are you guys looking at this criminally? Is the FBI looking at it? So I think some of it has no malintention. It is just that people are operating so strictly within their lanes. They're not thinking about collateral uses, nor are they thinking about collateral services that could be brought to bear. So some of it is just simply more information about who's out there on the team with you and what they can do to help you figure out who did what to whom on your network.
May I add one quick comment to that? One of the things that we're grappling with, and several of the other federal agencies are as well, is when we do have information that we want to share with each other or with the private sector, is how we're able to protect it, particularly if it's particularly the sensitive information, and I'm speaking specifically of site security information. We certainly don't want that information to get in the wrong hands. And the government's ability, given the Freedom of Information Act, provides great limitations to that, short of classifying the material. So we're looking for solutions. I think there's some that are being proposed in the Congress, even in the Homeland Security legislation, to protect sensitive information that's the private sector shares with government that doesn't merit a full classification status. But it's a big policy issue and a practical issue that we're going to have to continue to grapple with.
Yeah. Was that not a big stumbling block in getting the ISACs up and running with the CHOW, the Critical Information Assurance Office?
I think that was an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the issue that the ISACs, the reason why the ISACs exist.
Another question from the floor? Hey.
This question's for Martha. Does this process of road mapping, information sharing, does this have to be mandated from above? Does that really need to happen to make this really interagency wide?
Well, I suppose it would help, but there's no reason why agencies can't begin to map out from themselves, as we're doing in the Justice Department. I mean, look, this is a distributed problem, securing networks. We need a distributed solution because a lot of the powers and capabilities are in offices that some of us haven't even thought about. So one of the things we can do in the absence of some edict from on high to map the world is we can begin to create our own maps and to share them with each other. That's how the internet was created. It's a network of networks. We can do the same thing. And in order to be as effective as we can in my office, the computer crime section, that's exactly what we do. You know, one of the things that I say to people all the time is we're like a big router. We have our own services, our own core services and powers and responsibilities. But one of the other things we do is we route information to other entities and agencies that we've found in our travels if we see two other computers or agencies in this case that ought to be talking to each other. That's how we become more effective as a group. If they do the same thing, then that effect is magnified.
Yes.
For quite a number of years, we've been involved in a similar challenge as this, and I particularly direct this towards Martha with regard to sharing information. That's been the counter-drug issue. We have, particularly I worked with the military for a period of time where we were involved with intelligence gathering and the ability or inability to share that information among federal, state, and local organizations and the restrictions there. And we've been in that, at least the military has been involved with that since about 1989. Of course, the country much longer than that. Have we learned anything from that experience of sharing information? Because it hadn't got a lot better the last time I checked on it in the past 14 years or so. I just wonder if maybe we can learn from that experience in the counter-drug business because it's so related. The same agencies are involved, and it's a similar problem. What have we learned from that we can apply to this new issue of counterterrorism?
The true answer is I don't know whether there are any lessons learned. I know that there have in the past been some studies that have focused specifically on sharing information between law enforcement and the intelligence communities. There were some studies and reports that were very helpful and probably are the product, although I don't know that, of the drug wars, as they are called. But I think we need to be able to, if anything, broaden the scope to include the technology community, both inside and outside of government.
Okay, and we are running out of time for this session. I want to thank Marty and David very much, and please give them a hand. Thank you.
Thank you to David and to Marty for their excellent presentations, and thank you, Doc, for your excellent job as moderator. It is now a great honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Mark A. Holman serves as Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security. In addition to being one of the principal advisors to Homeland Security Director Tom Ridge, Mark oversees the Office of Homeland Security's External Affairs team, which includes intergovernmental affairs, public liaison, congressional affairs, and communications. Mark has worked with Governor Ridge in numerous capacities for nearly 2 decades. This includes serving as Governor Ridge's Chief of Staff from 1995 to 2000, as well as Chief of Staff to then Congressman Ridge from 1983 to 1991. Mark also served as campaign manager for Governor Ridge's successful 1994 gubernatorial campaign and then directed the Ridge-Schweiker transition team. In addition to his service to Governor Ridge, Mark has a wide range of political management experience. In 1988, he was Deputy Director of National Voter Coalitions for the George H.W. Bush for President campaign. He also worked on the George H.W. Bush for President campaign in 1980, and then later that year worked on the Reagan-Bush Committee as the Western Pennsylvania Field Director. Before his presidential campaign experience, Mark worked for the late Senator John Hines. When I spoke to Governor Ridge last week, he told me that Mark was the Office of Homeland Security's best speaker, and that in the future, if we needed its second best speaker, to call Governor Ridge. Please join me in welcoming Mark Holman as today's keynote speaker.
Morning. Pleasure to bring you greetings on behalf of the President and Governor Ridge. A little bit going on. Just one aside, though. I'm a kid from Western Pennsylvania, pretty much coal country, Indiana County, and what a tremendous weekend of heroism. Governor Schweiker is a good friend of mine that succeeded Governor Ridge, and just a wonderful time to see folks working together and perhaps some divine intervention as well. But just my heart goes out to my friends and family in Western Pennsylvania. I want to share with you a little bit and hopefully answer a few questions. And one point I want to make at the outset that I think is overlooked in the rush is that this nation, all of us included, we have been a nation very much in action since 9/11, and I don't think we in the public or the state or the local or the private sector give ourselves enough credit for the action that we've taken to make this a stronger and a safer nation. I always have to start as well, and a positive note, but it's important every time we talk about Homeland Security to be reminded of the nature, the constant nature of our threat and the evil, as the President properly refers to it, of terrorism. These people that we deal with and talked about at a conference in New York, a counterterrorism conference with some frontline responders, they're almost cult-like in their operation. They've tried to hijack a great religion, and they're cult-like, but they've combined it with semblances of militaristic planning and organization. They're obviously willing to take their own lives. They value life over death. Only recently have they found value in women and children when they have found that they too can be used as implements of terrorism. And the nature of this challenge, their dispersal within this country and throughout the globe, reminds us that every day we need to be prepared. Since 9/11, a couple of steps as it relates to the Office of Homeland Security and where we're at right now. On 9/20, the President called for the creation of the office before a joint session of Congress and called Governor Ridge to duty. And that evening, he called for us to work together and create a national strategy to help combat the fight against terrorism to build a stronger and safer America. And on 10/8, when Governor Ridge arrived and was sworn in the East Room, one of the memorable comments in his opening statement was that he reminded his colleagues in the federal government that the only turf that the President had asked him to protect was the ground that he was standing on that day. And on the 9th of October, it was a reminder of our vulnerability with the postmark on the Dashiell letter. Anthrax arrived in the mail. It had come to Florida, and now it had come to the nation's capital in New York City. And it was a graphic reminder for 6 of us in that office early on as to the extraordinary challenge that we faced. Give you an example jurisdictionally. Just think about the District of Columbia, the number of entities that we were dealing with. Capitol Hill, governance in the House, governance in the Senate. We had anthrax a little bit in the mailrooms of the Supreme Court. We had the District of Columbia, our federal partners. We had the U.S. Secret Service that has protective measures for the White House mail system. We had the EPA and scientists for the EPA. We had scientists from the Department of Justice, from various branches within our military system. We found that we had archaic science, disparate sources, crossed lines of jurisdiction, and everyone mobilized. Tragically, we lost 5 Americans from that attack from anthrax, and yet it was probably the most graphic example as to how jurisdictionally we were spread out, not only in terms of a preparation, but in terms of a response and a recovery. And it became obvious fairly early on as we worked on policy and national strategy that our federal organization and our interplay with state and local governments needed to change to meet the new threat. One of the first items that we talked about at our office is the challenges of constructing borders for the future. Secretary O'Neill has commented that, I think correctly, that our border system is more set for an 18th century land and toll collecting crossing than it is for our modern society as it relates to commerce, people, and security. And so we set out looking at commerce and borders and security as an obvious and immediate candidate for major change. We looked immediately and proposed in the President's 03 budget a $3.5 billion initiative for first responders. And while there is need for federal resources to help our state and local partners, the key in that proposal, as it moves through Capitol Hill, is the mutual aid, the interoperability, the joint training exercises and the like. The major point with that initiative federally was to bring programs at the Office of Domestic Preparedness and Justice together with the programs at FEMA and joined with the states and with local jurisdictions, not dividing the sources, not breaking down the traditional responsibility of federal grantor and grantee, and constructing a system where we're going to build capacity in this nation to be able to train, prepare, and respond together. And that is one of the most exciting new opportunities and challenges that we face. This federal government has been in action every day since 9/11. When you look back and think just anecdotally at some of the things that have been done, great work at the Department of Treasury on Green Quest, the Department of Justice and Congress, historic new powers with the Patriot Act, Department of Health and Human Services and the Bioterror Act, the wonderful job that the United States Secret Service did in an extraordinary partnership with the state of Utah and other federal partners in having having the safest Olympics that we possibly could have had under any circumstances. And I would add, and this is just scratching the surface, that the war on terrorism has had dramatic effects overseas and domestically in helping to protect us from future attack, developing new sources, and actioning information that we've received from overseas at home and back and forth. And every citizen in America, as they've been called to alert, it has been obvious every day that people are being smart, using their common sense, calling information that is being actioned. So the world that we live in today in this country, by virtue of everyone's actions and by an application of everyone's common sense, as we're in a higher national level of alert, has had great effect, and everyone deserves to feel proper credit for that. As we moved along on Office of Homeland Security's policy work, it became obvious that our goals should be bigger and bolder. And as we moved into the point this year when the President announced and called for the creation of the largest reform of the federal government in 50 years and was warmly received by members at Capitol Hill. I was with Governor Ridge when we went to the chamber in early June, and for someone bringing presidential legislation to be received by the leaders of the four chambers, both houses, in concert and in a bipartisan fashion, saying we're going to work with the President to get this done, that is an historic moment in American history and a real credit to everyone that's been involved for many years, some more recently, in crafting legislation that's going to protect our homeland. And share with you from my perspective the key pieces of what we have before the Hill that just went to historic enactment late last weekend. 4 pillars. One, borders and transportation security, land, sea, and air, people, commerce, and good, Coast Guard, Customs, INS, parts of the Department of Agriculture's inspection. This is an extraordinarily new partnership, INS, immigration policy. If we're going to do this, and we're going to do this as a nation, we need to do it in a way that reforms our immigration policies to make sense in the modern world. We need to know who's visiting us, why they're visiting us, how long they're intended to be here, obvious things that need to be done. We need one uniform, if you will, of the federal government when we're coming across the border, because information about cargo, people, revenue collection, they all tie together in what should be one system. The new transportation security agencies, with the extraordinary challenges that they've had standing up from whole cloth, a new entity very much is properly fixed in this new department. And at the end of the day, with a tremendous amount of work and tremendous amount of patience and understanding by the American people as we construct this system, we want to deploy technology, we want to use common sense, we want to reconstruct the federal government so that our friends, the 350 to 500 million people that visit us, go back and forth each year, of which about 150 million are not citizens, can cross our borders more quickly. Our goods can flow more rapidly, as they do in a partnership that we have with the Canadian government, where the automakers combined with 100 employers are pre-screening cargo on both sides of the border. The goal is to move people, commerce, and goods faster, and we definitely have the technology to do it. We have the security needs to do it as well. Talked a little bit about the First Responders Initiative, bringing together our natural disaster response expertise, expanding it to an incident command and control and response that's there in the event of another terrorist event, but is also made stronger by virtue of the addition of law enforcement in this equation. When we come to an event, we need to be able to respond without question, and we need to have a better unified federal chain of command. If we have a tornado or a flood or a hurricane, the federal family falls in quickly behind FEMA. If we have something that may be a terrorist incident, we're not quite as sure about command and control on site. And this new department would have the ability to bring all agencies together, including law enforcement, including the FBI, on site in a coordinated federal fashion. The one good example I have is Flight 587 over New York. This is like a day in our lives in Homeland Security, where we have incident management responsibility. Came to work, it was Veterans Day, and I thought today is first day in a month that maybe go in the morning. Governor Ridge was slated to be kicked around on IMUS, so I figured I'd go in and watch my boss get beat up a little bit, and then I was going to go home and rake leaves. Came in, and the governor was on the air with IMUS. I was in the outer office and had CNN on, and a plume of smoke goes down over New York City. I walk in at the time that IMUS had the pleasure of saying, "Governor, do you know something has happened in New York City?" It's like I knew before the director of the Office of Homeland Security that we had an event. Immediately, the governor's down in the White House Situation Room, calling in the cabinet, secure video conference, hoping that this was only a major domestic airline incident. National Transportation Safety Board, as they should be, are on their way to New York. New York's first responders are on the way to a scene in a community that had lost so many firemen and law enforcement officials. I'm on my way from Andrews Air Force Base with Senator Clinton and Joe Albaugh to be on the scene and just represent our office in the event that this was something different. Look out my window, and our routine government flight was escorted by F-16s. To arrive on a site, decisions about what to be done at the FAA, whether to ground all the air transportation in the country and the like, relieved to believe that it wasn't a terrorist incident, relieved to see that victims were being removed from the site so their families could have closure. This is a day in the life in New York City in the Office of Homeland Security, but it's a day that gives an example as to while something may happen in the future, we need a contiguous system of response. This new department will have a science and technology directorate that's going to call upon and help apply and focus the best of the federal laboratories within the Department of Energy, within the Department of Human Resources, to apply the same type of technology and know-how and focus that the Department of Defense has done in securing this nation over the years. It's a good parallel when you think about what we've been able to do by applying research and technology in national defense. If we relate it to what do we need to do to pre-screen cargo, what do we need to do for smart identity cards that we can voluntarily input information about ourselves and our guests in systems, what can we do and where should we do it with biosensor detection in our subways and the like. This new part of the new department is going to be critical in helping to partner with the sector and to advance technology and deploy it throughout the federal government. Probably the most interesting part from a public perspective and a lot of congressional interest in this is the new Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection Department. And we are working with Congress to put together a new product, a new capacity with some productive redundancy throughout the federal government, but to get the best sources of federal information from our intelligence agencies domestically and overseas to put it together and not replicate the raw data collection that they do, not replicate the law enforcement functions, but to take the information and analyze it and figure out how to deal with this very difficult challenge of vertical information sharing that we're going to be able to strategically analyze and share with the private sector and state and local government protective actions that we need to take to prevent terrorism based on the very best information that we have. And it's been a lively debate on the Hill. There's some skepticism from time to time. There are historic differences and different points of views as to which agencies provide what and in what measure. This is important, dramatic, new capacity. And I will share with folks, as well as this nation has changed, we are now for real in a world of vertical information sharing. Some days it's Governor Ridge on the phone directly to a governor or mayor. Some days it's our FBI offices. Some days it's our Nebraska Avenue complex that complements and supplements the work. Many, many challenges to how to figure out how to do this without compromising sources, but without compromising lives, without compromising methods. But we have to figure out how to do this productively and effectively. We are doing this as a federal government every day, and anyone that has the experience that we do in our offices should be comforted to know that within the federal family there's an historic new partnership that is very real and is yielding results. I'd like to share with audiences an observation about why this time I think this discussion about vertical information sharing will work and why it's really going to come true. One, if you work in the federal government, we all know the President expects us to get this done. There's no question about it, and he expects us to get it done quickly. But a major change in where we're at post 9/11 is Americans get it now as well. They understand what it means when a law enforcement officer pulls over someone for routine traffic violation, why that law enforcement officer may need part of information that is held on a variety of federal watch lists. The American people get it We all understand it. Our state and local partners are with us in this endeavor, and this time, however long it takes, this is going to be a very productive part of our new public safety matrix. Also in this new department, very appropriately, the United States Secret Service, who has unique roles in protecting the presidency, our continuity of government, and the like, and affirmed, as we've talked often, is an Office of Homeland Security that will reside by nature of a confidential advisor to the President in the White House after the new department is created. One issue that the President feels very strongly about, and it's being debated on the Hill, is that this position be a non-Senate confirmed position, because the President feels correctly that he ought to have on his staff, like he has with National Security Advisor Dr. Condoleezza Rice, a confidential advisor that can serve him, accessible to Congress, but serve him in a confidential capacity, working not only with the new department, but with other agencies in government that will continue to deal with Homeland Security. I'll wrap up and be happy to try to answer some questions with a note of encouragement and I think some valued perspective. When President Truman signed the National Security Act in 1947 that created the beginnings of the Department of Defense and created the National Security Council, historians indicate that it took until about 1986 till the current Pentagon system Joint Command was perfected, and we're perfecting it again a little bit more with the standing up of the North American Command, which is another important part of our homeland defense. The President, Congress, the private sector, state and locals, we as a nation are moving a lot more quickly than that. And however long it takes to put together this new department, it's going to take less time than that. And the current debate in the Senate is down to a couple of very narrow issues. And one, the issues from the President's perspective, is a very time-tested initiative and prerogative that presidents have had since Jimmy Carter have had, that indicates that in times of national security, the President may need the prerogative to move an entity or an agency in a way that is outside of the traditional white or blue-collar agreement in the federal government. He has also respectfully asked his partners in the appropriations process in Capitol Hill to give the new secretary a little bit of flexibility in terms of moving money during the transition period, in recognition of the fact that we're trying to bring together 170,000 employees of the federal government from 23 different odd agencies, 8 different cabinet agencies, together in a time perspective germane to the challenge and meeting the expectation of the American people. And so while we may or may not get a bill out of the Senate, they're moving quickly. The issues are basic. We'll get through it, and we'll get through it soon. But overall, the nation and Congress and the administration and you all have been working quickly, and we will continue to be vigilant every day as we organize ourselves to prevent and respond to the terrorist challenge that we face. So with that, if I have a few minutes for questions.
Have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, sir.
Flexibility issue. It seems to be the big difference between the House approved legislation and the Senate debating legislation. Could you expand on that a little bit in terms of the importance of those factors?
Yeah, I would be happy to. And I actually have a list of all the times since the Carter administration that the President has called on the national security exemption. And, you know, if you look through them, there isn't anything in this publicly available list that is not obvious on its face to be national security. This new department will have 18 collective bargaining units, which represents, I think, about 40% of the workforce. The President has said, Governor Ridge met last week with President of the AFL-CIO, John Sweeney. This is not about collective bargaining rights. The President supports them and will continue to support them. It's not about whistleblower protection. It's in there. It's not about not having a robust Inspector General to protect the public's interest. It's not about anything except for a prerogative that presidents have had since President Carter to be able to move quickly or to designate a certain segment of employees, nationally security, of a particular sensitivity that either the white or the blue-collar agreement that the group has might not properly apply to that. That is all that's about. And it is, I think, I understand as a Pennsylvanian strong labor state that the leadership of labor feels that this may be threatening the collective bargaining rights of the unions. Nothing could be further from the case, and I think the President has made that clear, and I think as time goes by, we'll be able to work through that. But really, that's all that's about, and we wish we were moving to final enactment. There's still a week of Senate action, but regardless of whether the Senate moves this week or in September, they're still moving very quickly, and pleased with the progress that Senator Lieberman and others are making. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm reasonably familiar with both the House and the Senate bill. One curiosity that strikes me is even though you have the Office of Homeland Security that will be supporting the Homeland Security Council, if you look at the counterpart, the NSC, which does policy coordination, in the Department of Defense, though, you still have a Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and in the Department of State, you have plans and policy. Where is the plans and policy organization in the Department of Homeland Security that is going to establish the overall policy and vision for the department?
It's a good question, and I know in the Senate bill in particular, there are some other undersecretariats that are being created. I think the feeling was with the construction of the department, of which the Border and Transportation Security Undersecretariat, as we proposed it, will be an enormous, that will be a lion's share of the complement, if you will. The administration opted for a more streamlined structure. The policy and planning will be inherent in each of the undersecretariats as well as in the Secretary's office. There is also, I think I neglected to mention, a proposed much more robust state and local function within the Secretary's office than has been the case, but they're not lost. They're not placed in the construction of an undersecretariat, and I don't think the Senate bill has that or the House bill, so there may be a time a year or so from now the Secretary's looking at that as a separate function, but I think it was more on the interest of trying to streamline the mission and the prerogatives. It is focused in less undersecretariats than the Department of Defense is. Now, I don't know, what did DOD start with? So there, you know, how the evolution of the department goes. It's also, I think, a focus in trying to assure Congress and the American people that we're not trying to create a new bureaucracy that on its face, its intent is to be bigger. Its intent is to be focused on a new mission while not losing the work that Coast Guard and FEMA and others do in ancillary missions. But the mission focus, I think, was key in the construction. Yes, sir.
In the morning session, there was some talk about how especially the FBI has a limited ability to analyze information, and how that money for that is not coming to the 2004 budget. How do you see that?
The FBI, I know the administration proposed dramatic increase in the Bureau's spending, and Director Mueller is in the midst of a dramatic and necessary reorganization of the Bureau. I don't know their exact dollar amount. It's without question that the FBI is going to build their capacity, and within the new department have a new partner to do some of the strategic threat assessment. In the President's request for Homeland Security of the $37 billion that we started out with in 2003, there's $14 billion in additional spending, and that's one of the things that we pointed out on the Hill is they've said, well, you don't intend to spend more for this new department. You're using existing resources. We said we intend to spend $14 billion more than we did last year, and if you give the Secretary the ability to move funds, we had proposed 5% immediately to just as we bring organizations together. I think the House mark at 2%. We believe we'll be able to do the job on budget. There's no question that we're going to have to apply, and the President has applied more resources on this new mission. Coast Guard had the largest increase in their budget in their history, and we're all in tight fiscal times. Our partners in state and local government are in tight fiscal times, but this is a new priority that we all need to figure out how to meet and how to share, apportion the responsibility, state, federal, and local. 85% of the infrastructure in this country is privately owned, so our friends in the private sector are painfully aware of the challenge that they face in working with us.
International investor. Following September 11th, we saw an FBI agent come to Washington to testify that while she was desperately trying to alert the authorities in Washington about some terrorist activity and information, she was stymied by a lot of emails and senseless memorandum going back and forth. Now you're telling us that a bureaucracy this large, layered on top of the existing intelligence and other agencies here in Washington, aren't going to exacerbate that problem? Can you really tell us that there aren't going to be tens of thousands of memorandums and emails generated while all these parties tell each other what they should and could be doing?
I would share with you, as I've mentioned earlier in my comments, that this government, this federal government, has changed. Not that it won't be vulnerable to making mistakes in the future, it will. There's always room for human error in anything that any of us do, but the actions that Director Mueller is taking at the FBI today and how he has embraced many of the suggestions that have been made, the Bureau itself is entirely being reorganized to move information up. As my witness to where I work, information between agencies and the federal government is being shared, and the challenge of actioning it and doing it more effectively, we truly believe that this new department is going to be a critical link not only to figuring out how to best action information that we already have within the federal family, but as importantly, being able to figure out and work with the private sector and state and local governments to help them decide when and how to apply protective resources, whether it be on a subway, whether it be on a bridge, whatever it be the case, whether it be a need for a region or an alert to financial services to go out. We believe this new capacity will help. It is a new product. It is productively complementary, and it will require years and years and years of work, but it is a work in motion, and we think the new mission focus of the department will definitely help, and the federal government working with state and local government are in just an entirely new mindset. People need to be aware of that. This is not your 9-10 federal government serving you today, and we have a lot of challenges, but we have tens of thousands of people going today to work every day to secure this homeland, and working as a team, we're going to do this better. One of the things that I think is so dramatic and so important about the Homeland Security project and is manifest in this new department, and someone coming from state government, from big state government in Pennsylvania, I have a unique perspective on this. We have an extraordinary opportunity to partner with state and local governments as we have never, ever, ever, ever done before. And the benefits of changing that relationship from a federal money that gives money and audits to a federal government that is working with state and local governments in the programs and in the training and in the exercise and in true partnership, therein I think lies an opportunity that will be manifest well outside of the rubric of Homeland Security. And I think within the federal government as well, this interagency shakeup, if you will be very, very positive as agencies look outside of the rubric as to how they'll work together in the future. The President certainly shown a willingness to do whatever it takes to bring together people in federal service to meet challenges, and that could apply to a lot of areas beyond Homeland Security. So it's this is not your 9-10 government. Time, maybe one more question? One more question. Sir.
Hi, good morning. Mr. Holman, on the Department of Homeland Security being very complex, full spectrum, and also the desire to reduce redundant capabilities, do you have any insights that you can share on either the processes or importance of requirements, validation, and prioritization?
The OMB loves this project. You can imagine the investments that they've made in technology over the years with less success than the interagency groups would have it. OMB is working right now on transition, not prejudging the outcome of the legislation, but Governor Ridge chairs a team, and we're looking at the human resource systems, we're looking at the technological functions, and I think this will expedite some of the fusion, some of the information sharing that we've been working on at OMB and at Homeland Security and agency by agency. How quickly that can come about remains to be seen. The urgency of the mission will continue to push it, but I think those that have sought and desired interagency technological cooperation, if you will, are one, very encouraged by the project, and this will force it along. I have, as a manager, and I maintain my email with some great help with my staff on a daily basis. I'm not a technology expert, but I understand that decisions we make about information are made by people. The technology that we see and that we have will facilitate good decisions made by good people working together in government. And this new department, I think, has a tremendous potential to do that internally. And again, part of its mission mandate is to hook up with the private sector. Someone mentioned earlier the challenge with the private sector about bringing in information to this new information threat alert system within the new department. We do believe that some of that information should be provided with Freedom of Information Act protection. Doesn't mean a community doesn't have right to know protection if a chemical plant is in your community, but there are information that the private sector has that we want to encourage them to bring in, and at certain times for national security, sometimes for economic security for an entity, we want to be able to have that information to help protect the nation and the nation's critical infrastructure. And these are tricky discussions in the media and on the Hill, but it's high time we have them. The pendulum has swung a little bit too far, and I think we can find a balance, but I think we can bring together systems more quickly as a result of this reorganization. We have to.
Please join me in thanking Mark Holman for his outstanding keynote address. Thank you again, Mark, for your outstanding presentation. Thank you for attending today's Homeland Security financing briefing. I'd like to thank our keynote speaker, all of our outstanding speakers and moderators for their service today, and I thank you, America's Homeland Security business leaders, for participating. We look forward to seeing you at the next Homeland Security financing briefing to be held here at the National Press Club on Monday, August 26th. For details on this briefing and for other resources which may assist you please visit our website at www.globalsecurity.bz. And on your way out today, please stop by the registration desk and consider purchasing a copy of the Homeland Security Directory, which is also available at our website, www.globalsecurity.bz. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on August 26th.